The summer of 1998 was drawing to a close when the Morrison family loaded up their car, filled with coolers, camping gear, and laughter, in preparation for what was meant to be a picture-perfect getaway to Mammoth Cave, Kentucky. It was intended to be a week of nature, bonding, and relaxation beneath the towering trees and echoing caves. That moment, that departure, would be the final time anyone would see the Morrison family alive. 2 full decades passed without a trace. 2 decades of unanswered questions and fading hope. But everything changed unexpectedly when a drone flew silently above a secluded stretch of forest land in the remote wilderness of eastern Kentucky. A land surveyor, contracted to chart the terrain for a conservation report, maneuvered the drone over thick canopies and shadowy clearings. What he saw through the drone's camera lens made his heart stutter. Concealed under layers of vines, soil, and time itself lay a gaping sinkhole. As the drone hovered lower, the hidden depth of the pit revealed itself like a secret graveyard. At the bottom lay an eerie mosaic of rust-stained metal, a chaotic tangle of abandoned vehicles, their twisted frames hunched together like discarded relics. Hundreds of cars, all corroded and contorted, layered upon each other in an almost deliberate pile, like the aftermath of some forgotten catastrophe. Among the metal wreckage sat a sun-bleached yellow sedan, its shape unmistakable to anyone familiar with the Morrison family's story. But it wasn't just the Morrison car that lay in that iron crypt. As investigators combed through the wreckage, each vehicle unearthed told a chilling story. License plates registered to families reported missing from neighboring states, personal effects left inside, weathered children's toys on back seats, half-read maps, suitcases still zipped shut. These cars were not abandoned, they were buried. What law enforcement uncovered wasn't just a fluke discovery. It was the unraveling of a gruesome secret. Evidence pointed to an organized and methodical operation that had been hiding in plain sight for over 20 years. The cars hadn't simply ended up there by chance. They had been taken, their occupants eliminated, their remains hidden deep beneath the forest floor. It was a systematic, merciless enterprise that preyed on traveling families, transforming innocent vacations into calculated opportunities for profit and murder. For years, loved ones of the missing had clung to fading photographs and hollow updates, unaware their relatives had all ended up in the same horrifying final destination. Each car was like a sealed time capsule, sealed away from the world. Inside one, investigators found a mold-covered lunchbox, still packed with a sandwich and an apple, uneaten. In another, a forgotten camcorder with just enough battery left to flash red for a moment when turned on. The footage inside it, partially recovered, showed a laughing couple making roadside coffee, unaware they were filming their final moments together. And right there, wedged between a rusted Dodge minivan and a compact red SUV with Ohio plates, was the unmistakable yellow 1996 Honda Accord, belonging to the Morrisons. The same model that had been reported missing on August 12, 1998. It was dented, its windows shattered by time and earth, but still bore a faded dealership sticker on the bumper that read, "Brennan's Auto Sales, Cars You Can Trust." For Jake Morrison, the youngest member of the family and the only one not in that car, the call came on a dusty Tuesday morning. He was midway through smoothing drywall in a stranger's kitchen when his phone buzzed in his pocket. Covered in dust, tired from weeks of non-stop jobs, he almost didn't answer. But something about the unknown number with a Kentucky area code made him pause. "Jake Morrison?" the voice on the other end asked. "This is Officer Beth Coleman, Kentucky State Police. I'm calling in regard to your family." Her words hit like a freight train. Jake hadn't heard those words in 20 years, but they still landed with the same gut-wrenching force. The officer continued, her tone measured and gentle. She explained how a drone survey had led to the discovery of a massive sinkhole deep in the woods, one filled with vehicles, dozens, if not more. Among them, a car that matched the make, model, and color of the Morrison family's long-lost Honda. "We'd like you to come and help us confirm the identification," she said. You're listed as next of kin. Jake sat on the porch steps outside the Patterson job, his hands still caked in white joint compound, the phone pressed between his shoulder and cheek. The noise from inside the house faded as the weight of the moment took hold. "I'll be there tonight," he replied, his voice steadier than he felt. The drive from Columbus to Bowling Green was a blur. He didn't remember the scenery or the exit signs, just the gnawing sense of dread and the echo of Coleman's words playing over and over in his head. He checked into a motel with peeling wallpaper and a rattling air conditioner and spent the night staring at the ceiling, eyes wide open, waiting for morning. Sleep never came, but the hours passed anyway. At 8:45 the next morning, Jake stood outside the Kentucky State Police post in Bowling Green, the stale motel coffee still clutched in his hand. He wasn't ready, but he wasn't going to wait another minute. The door opened, and a tall woman in a tailored blazer stepped out. "Jake Morrison?" she asked. He nodded. "Detective Amanda Cross," she introduced herself, extending a hand. Her grip was firm, her eyes sharp but not unkind. Inside the station, she briefed him with professionalism that masked a deep undercurrent of empathy. She'd worked cold cases for over a decade, and while most went nowhere, this one had cracked wide open. They reviewed drone photos first, then satellite images, and finally the on-site footage from officers who had rappelled down into the pit. The camera trembled as it panned across rusted roofs and busted windshields. And there it was, the yellow Honda Accord, half submerged in mud and creeping ivy. Jake recognized it immediately. Even after all those years, he could still see his dad's goofy grin as he washed the car every Saturday. The way his mom had tucked an emergency kit in the trunk, the blanket with cartoon prints they always brought on road trips. He swallowed hard, not trusting his voice. They drove out to the site that afternoon. The road narrowed into a gravel path before dissolving into a dirt trail, accessible only by off-road vehicles. The woods grew denser, darker, until the canopy above felt like a ceiling. Police tape fluttered in the wind. Beyond it, the earth dipped sharply. The sinkhole yawned open like a mouth that had been waiting to speak for 2 decades. Crews had set up scaffolding and floodlights. Drones buzzed overhead. Jake stood at the edge, peering down at the graveyard of cars. It felt like staring into the past. Not just his, but dozens of other families as well. Each vehicle was a story abruptly ended, a life rerouted without explanation. And now those silent stories were screaming to be heard. The Honda was being lifted with care by a crane. As it emerged from the pit, caked in mud and draped in vines, a collective hush fell over the scene. The corroded license plate was unreadable, but the VIN number, once verified, left no doubt. It was them. It was real. Jake felt his knees buckle, but Detective Cross caught his arm. "They're coming home," she said quietly. That moment marked the beginning of a reckoning, not just for Jake, but for law enforcement, for the state of Kentucky, and for every family still searching for answers. The Morrison disappearance was no longer a mystery. It was a crime scene, and behind it lay a network of corruption and greed that had thrived in the shadows for far too long. He didn't sleep. Instead, he sat cross-legged on the motel's scratchy, faded bedspread, the hum of the air conditioner barely masking the noise in his head. He reached for his phone, opened the Photos app, and scrolled to a tucked-away folder he hadn't looked at in years, one he both cherished and feared. It was filled with pictures of a life that now felt like someone else's memory. There was one of his parents on their wedding day, standing outside a church with rice in their hair, smiles so wide and untouched by tragedy. They looked impossibly young, his dad in a suit that didn't quite fit, his mom radiant in a dress borrowed from her sister. He swiped again. Sarah, in her blue homecoming dress, rolled her eyes at him as he snapped photos from the stairwell. "You're so annoying, Jake," she'd said, laughing, trying to act cool while clearly enjoying the attention. Jenny came next, missing her 2 front teeth and proudly holding up a crayon drawing she'd done at school. 5 stick figures holding hands in front of a red-roofed house with a crooked chimney and a tree that looked more like a lollipop. It was their house, their family. All of them are still together. Then, the photo that always hit the hardest. The last one ever taken of them as a unit. August 1998. Morning light through the kitchen window. His dad placing a cooler into the trunk of the yellow Accord, checking the bungee cords like he always did. Mom was double-checking her purse, probably for the 3rd time, making sure she hadn't forgotten the campground reservation or sunscreen. Sarah and Jenny were mid-argument over who got the window seat. Pure chaos, pure normal. In the blurry background, just inside the house, you could see a shape on the couch. A boy under a blanket, thermometer in his mouth, a box of tissues on his chest. Jake, 14 years old, sulking and sniffling. He remembered how angry he'd been, furious to miss the trip. It had felt like the end of the world. Now, 2 decades later, he couldn't stop wondering, had that flu saved his life? Or had it condemned him to 2 decades of survivor's guilt? At 8:30 the next morning, Jake sat in the parking lot of the Kentucky State Police Post, the photo of his family still open on his phone, coffee from the gas station growing cold in the cup holder. The world around him was quiet, sterile. Officers in dark uniforms passed through sliding glass doors, glancing but not stopping. His fingers trembled as he brought the coffee to his lips. It tasted like burnt rubber, worse than the day before. He was about to take another sip when a figure stepped out of the building. A woman, mid-40s, compact build, dressed in a slate-gray blazer and dark jeans, walked directly toward his truck with a purposeful stride. Jake rolled down his window as she approached. "Jake Morrison?" she asked. Her voice was calm, confident, but not cold. He nodded. "Detective Amanda Cross," she said, extending a hand. "I'm truly sorry we're meeting under these circumstances." Her handshake was firm. She had short, tidy brown hair and eyes that looked like they'd seen things no one should, but somehow they still held a glimmer of warmth. Jake liked her instantly. "Officer Coleman said you specialize in cold cases?" he asked, stepping out of his truck. "I've been with the department for 23 years, she replied. "The last 8 focused solely on unresolved disappearances, families who deserve answers, even if they're not the answers we want." She led him to a discreet gray sedan parked off to the side. As they buckled in, she turned slightly toward him. "Before we head out," she said gently, "I need you to know that this isn't going to be easy. This isn't just a car found in the woods. What Dale Rivers stumbled on, it's something bigger. Something different." Jake felt a pressure build in his chest. "What do you mean?" "The sinkhole," Cross began, "is enormous. 60 feet across, at least 40 feet deep. And it's full of cars. Dozens, possibly over 100. Not abandoned junkers either. These are vehicles from the late 90s and early 2000s. All kinds. Family sedans, minivans, SUVs. Stacked, arranged, like someone organized them." Jake blinked. "Arranged? By whom?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," she said, starting the engine. "Your family's car is one piece in a puzzle that stretches decades." They drove in silence for a time, winding through Kentucky's rolling hills, past barns and broken fences, into land where cell service dropped and the trees grew thick and wild. The morning air was cool and crisp, and the sky was a wide, pale blue. Jake felt a strange mix of dread and determination swirling inside him. Hope was too fragile a word. He hadn't dared hope in 20 years, but something inside him had shifted. He was here. He was finally about to see the place that had swallowed his family whole. The road narrowed to little more than tire tracks. The sedan bounced over roots and ruts. Branches scraped the sides of the car. Jake gripped the handle on the passenger side. "How did Rivers even find this?" he asked. "Dumb luck," Cross said. "He was surveying timber value for a logging company. His drone was on a programmed grid when it caught something strange, unusual shapes beneath the canopy. He zoomed in, adjusted angles, and saw metal. Lots of it. Jake glanced out the window. Sunlight filtered through the dense leaves above, casting moving shadows on the hood of the car. It all looked unreal, like the edge of a dream. "How much farther?" he asked. "Another mile or so," Cross replied. "Then we walk." The sedan crested a small rise and rounded a bend. Ahead, the woods opened into a natural clearing. Several marked cruisers were parked on the side of a dirt path. A white forensics van sat under a canopy, and a battered red pickup, likely Rivers, was parked just beyond the tape. Yellow crime scene tape stretched between trees, fluttering gently in the breeze. Officers moved in and out of the perimeter. The low hum of generators pulsed in the background. There was a tension in the air one Jake could feel in his teeth. Cross shut off the engine. Before they stepped out, she turned to him again. "Jake, I need you to prepare yourself. This isn't like a junkyard or an accident site. These vehicles, they've been down there a long time. Some are nothing more than rusted shells." Jake nodded. He'd come this far. He couldn't back down now. "If you feel overwhelmed, tell me. No judgment." He followed her toward the tree line. Officers stepped aside to let them pass. Jake could hear bits of conversation, the occasional crackle of a radio, the whir of a camera shutter. He saw technicians in white suits standing near the edge, peering down into what looked like a chasm in the forest floor. As he stepped up beside Cross, the ground suddenly opened before him, massive, dark, impossibly deep. And down in the depths, partially buried, mottled with mud and vines, were cars. Dozens, hundreds. A chaotic graveyard of twisted frames and shattered windshields. Jake stared into the sinkhole, feeling the weight of 20 years settle like lead in his bones. Somewhere down there was his family's last known location, the place their story ended, or perhaps where the truth was finally beginning to surface. Amid the buzzing of equipment and murmured radio chatter, the one sound Jake couldn't drown out was the pounding of his own heartbeat. Loud, fast, relentless. It throbbed in his ears like a war drum, louder than anything around him. A man in grease-smudged coveralls and a faded baseball cap approached them, boots crunching against the forest floor. His face was tanned and worn from years of sun and wind, and his hands bore the permanent grime of a life spent outdoors. "You must be a family member," he said gently, extending a hand. "Dale Rivers," he added. "I'm really sorry about all this." Jake shook his hand. "You're the one who found them." Rivers gave a single solemn nod. "Been surveying land since I was in my 20s. Thought I'd seen just about everything, but nothing like that hole." Detective Cross gestured toward the dense woods. "Would you show us?" Rivers led them into the forest, following a path marked with bright orange spray paint splashed across tree trunks. The underbrush had been trampled down recently, but it was still uneven terrain, roots snaking across the ground like tripwires. They walked for nearly 200 yards, the smell of pine and damp earth gradually giving way to something sharper, more synthetic. Jake wrinkled his nose as a pungent chemical odor hit him, likely from the preservation agents or accelerants used by the forensics team. Then they crested a low rise, and Jake saw it. The trees fell away, revealing a colossal chasm in the earth, an unnatural scar amid the Kentucky woods. Portable floodlights had been erected around the perimeter, casting harsh beams down into the abyss. The shadows danced as workers moved past the lights, creating an eerie interplay of movement and stillness. And down in the sinkhole, in layer after horrifying layer, were the vehicles. Cars of all makes and models, some nearly consumed by rust, others looking only slightly aged. Sedans, SUVs, pickups, and vans, all crammed into the cavity like discarded toys. Some rested on their sides, others wedged between boulders or pinned under larger vehicles. Dozens, maybe hundreds. It was a mechanical mausoleum. Jake stumbled forward, his knees going soft beneath him. He caught himself against a nearby tree and exhaled a sharp breath. Jesus, he whispered, barely audible. Cross came beside him. "The yellow Honda is over there," she said softly, pointing halfway, down the slope. In the far corner. Jake didn't respond immediately. His eyes were locked on the site below, on the metal tomb that had entombed his family's final moments. The forensics team had cleared some of the surrounding brush to better access the edge, and scaffolding lined one side, ready for rappelling. "Do you want to get closer?" Cross asked. Jake hesitated, then nodded. His legs felt unsteady, but he made them move. They walked the perimeter carefully, boots crunching against the gravel the team had laid to reduce erosion. Cross pointed again. "There." Jake's gaze followed her finger, and there it was. Despite 2 decades of exposure, grime, and decay, he recognized the yellow Honda instantly. The sloping rear window, the dent on the passenger side from a rogue shopping cart, the rusted roof rack still clinging to the skeleton of the car like a memory refusing to fade. "That's it," Jake said. His voice was thin, distant, as if echoing through someone else's throat. "That's their car." Cross scribbled a note into her pad. "We'll need you to formally ID it once we extract it, but this confirms a lot." Jake kept staring into the sinkhole, his thoughts racing. "How long has this been going on?" Cross didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked out over the wreckage, her brow furrowed. "Based on preliminary analysis," she said at last, "the earliest models down there are from the early 90s. The most recent date we've seen dates around 2005 or 2006, so at least 15 years. Jake shook his head slowly. "Someone's been dumping cars here for 15 years? Rivers, who had stayed respectfully back, stepped up beside them. "That's not even the weirdest part. Look again. That's not just random piling. Somebody took the time to arrange them, stacked them smart, fit the smaller ones between gaps. It's all deliberate." Jake narrowed his eyes and studied the scene again. Rivers was right. The layout wasn't chaotic. It was calculated. A brutal kind of logic to it. Sedans slotted under SUVs, trucks anchoring corners. It looked like someone had played a game of Tetris with scrap metal and lives. "Who would do something like this?" Jake asked, barely above a whisper. "Someone with access to machinery," Cross replied, "and someone who knew no one would disturb this land. The property belongs to a timber company out of Nashville. According to records, this section hasn't been logged or surveyed in over 30 years. Just then, a woman in white coveralls approached. She was younger than Jake expected, early 30s maybe, with black hair pulled tight under a cap. She held a tablet in one hand, and her face was drawn, serious. "Detective Cross," she said. "We've got something you need to see." Cross turned to Jake. "You good to keep going?" Jake nodded, though the queasiness rising in his gut suggested otherwise. Everything around him felt like a hallucination, like a dream someone else was dreaming for him. The technician led them around the rim of the sinkhole to another vantage point. She pointed down toward a tangled collection of cars near the base. "See that blue pickup with the white camper shell?" she said. Jake nodded. It was half buried under another vehicle, but still visible. "We got a partial plate, ran it through national databases. The match came back. Reported stolen in 1999 from a campground near land between the lakes. Belonged to the Henderson family. Parents and 2 kids, all vanished. Their site was found abandoned." Cross's face darkened. "I remember that case," she said. "Tennessee filed it. Tent still set up, food still on the table. But the family? Gone, vanished into thin air." Jake's stomach turned. "How many more?" The technician tapped on her tablet. "We've identified partial plates from 16 vehicles. So far, at least 8 matches with known disappearances, all families, all between the late 90s and mid-2000s. We're still checking the rest." Jake felt his breath catch. 8 families, maybe more. The scale of it hit him like a physical force. This wasn't just about the Morrisons. This was about dozens of people, parents, children, entire lives erased and dumped in a hole no one knew existed. Cross exhaled. "We need to go down." She turned to the technician, who nodded and began prepping the gear. Repelling harnesses were laid out and helmets distributed. The descent would be slow, careful, hazardous. Jake watched as Cross clipped in and joined two other forensics team members, stepping onto the scaffold with steady movements. They began lowering into the pit, their headlamps flickering like fireflies in the gloom, casting shifting light over the rusting ruins below. The air above the pit carried a bitter chill, though the sun had climbed higher. Jake pulled his jacket tighter, but it did little to ease the cold gnawing at his bones. Around him, the forest was unnaturally quiet, as if even the birds understood what lay beneath and dared not sing. He kept his eyes on Cross, her silhouette shrinking as she descended. She moved methodically, her voice occasionally audible over the radio clipped to her vest. Every now and then, the light from her helmet would illuminate a splash of color. Old upholstery, a faded license plate, a child's backpack half buried in debris. It was like looking into a mass grave. No longer just metal and rust, but the echoes of stories, of final moments, of lives taken without warning or justice. Jake clenched his fists, jaw tightening. He wasn't sure what they were going to find down there, but he knew, whatever it was only the beginning. From his perch at the edge of the sinkhole, Jake watched as Detective Cross navigated the labyrinth of mangled vehicles with a steadiness that spoke of years in the field. She moved cautiously, her boots crunching against twisted metal and gravel, pausing often to snap photos or jot notes into her weatherproof notepad. Every few minutes, her voice echoed faintly up through the humid air as she radioed updates to the team above. When she finally reached the yellow Honda, Jake leaned forward instinctively, hands gripping the railing. Cross circled the vehicle slowly, inspecting it from every possible angle. Her flashlight beam swept over the frame, flickering across rust-pocked panels and shattered glass. For nearly 20 minutes, she studied the car, silent and focused. Then she looked up and called, "Jake, I need you to see something. Can you come down?" The words landed like stones in his gut. Jake's first instinct was to say no. Every nerve in his body rebelled at the thought of entering that mechanical catacomb. But he'd come this far. If there were answers waiting below, he couldn't turn away now. A technician from the forensic team outfitted him with a safety harness and carefully explained how to use the rappelling gear. Jake listened numbly, his fingers clumsy as he clipped into the harness. Then, with a nod, he stepped over the edge. The descent felt like falling through time. 20 years of grief and mystery stretched out beneath him, the shadows closing in with every foot he dropped. The air grew denser, the temperature cooler, the smells more pungent. The mixture of corroded metal, mold, and something deeply organic, something wrong, made him breathe shallowly. When his boots finally hit the jagged surface, he nearly stumbled. Up close, the sinkhole was more than eerie. It was monstrous. The skeletal remains of cars loomed above him, stacked in grotesque formations, casting long shadows under the floodlights. The silence was absolute, broken only by the hum of generators and the occasional creak of shifting debris. Cross stood beside the Honda, her expression dark. "Come here," she said quietly. Jake approached carefully, stepping over bent fenders and broken glass. Cross pointed to the rear window. There. At first, he didn't see it. But then, as the light hit at just the right angle, he spotted the faint scratches etched into the grime-covered glass. Not random lines. Letters, words. Jake's blood turned to ice. "Help us!" The words were jagged and uneven, carved by a trembling hand with something sharp, maybe a key, maybe jewelry. Desperate, final. Jake staggered back a step, vision swimming. "They were alive," he whispered. "They were alive down here." Cross nodded solemnly. "The scratches are fairly fresh, probably made shortly before whatever happened. It could have been any of them." Jake stared at the words, feeling their weight settle on his chest like a stone. He reached out, placing a trembling hand on the car's trunk. The metal was cold, rough with age and rust. Faintly, just visible through the decay, was a sticker his mom had proudly placed years ago. Cartoon stick figures holding hands. A family. His family. It now looked more like an epitaph. "We need to check the interior," Cross said. "There might be more." The driver's door was crushed inward, its frame warped from the pressure of collapsed vehicles above. It took both of them pulling to pry it open, the sound of metal groaning under strain echoing through the pit. Crossed her flashlight inside, and Jake leaned in over her shoulder. The cabin was a ruin. The fabric of the seats was torn and mold-stained, the foam exposed and chewed through by vermin. The steering wheel was warped and brittle. The air inside the car was thick with mildew and something that hinted at death. Then Jake saw it. Nestled between the passenger seat and center console was a small, faded purple hair tie. The kind with a butterfly charm Jenny used to wear nearly every day. "That's hers," Jake choked out. "That's Jenny's." Cross used tweezers to retrieve it and gently placed it into an evidence bag. "We'll test for DNA," she said. "But if you're sure." "I'm sure," Jake replied. He remembered buying a pack of them one Friday afternoon. Jenny had lost hers at school and cried until he'd biked to the corner store to get more. She'd hugged him so tightly when he got back. They moved to the back seat. Cross swept her flashlight across the clutter inside, and more pieces of their lives came into view. A crumpled juice box, probably Sarah's. A romance paperback with the cover curled, something his mom would have read on quiet nights in the tent. And there, on the floor, half tucked under the seat, was a small gray stuffed elephant. Jake felt tears sting his eyes. "That was Jenny's too," he said hoarsely. "She called it Nellie. She had it since she was a baby, slept with it every night. She wouldn't have left it behind unless she didn't have a choice," Cross murmured. She sealed the elephant in another evidence bag, her gloved hands reverent. "Anything else about their routine? Habits? Something that could explain how they ended up here?" Jake shook his head slowly, trying to summon the memory of that final morning. "Dad planned everything. He always had a checklist: gas, oil, spare tire. He didn't take detours. He stuck to the same route every time, crossed out notes." "And their destination?" "Green River Campground," Jake said. "Mammoth Cave. We went every summer. Same site, same dates. It was a tradition. So they knew the roads well. Dad could have driven them blindfolded. There was even a place we always stopped, Turner's Travel Stop. About halfway. It had a little diner. Mom loved their pie. I remember the sign had this goofy cartoon trucker." Cross looked up, her brow furrowed. "Turner's, off Highway 31E?" Jake nodded. "That might be useful," she said, making a final note. "Especially if it was a predictable stop." She didn't say the rest, but Jake heard it anyway. If someone had been watching, if someone knew their habits, their route, their traditions, and had been waiting. A gust of wind stirred the leaves above, rustling through the trees that loomed over the sinkhole like silent witnesses. Jake leaned against the edge of the Honda, staring at the seat where his sister had probably sat for the last time. Every memory he'd buried was clawing its way to the surface. Family road trips filled with car games and sing-alongs. Jenny falling asleep with her head against the window. Sarah complaining about the music. He blinked hard, trying to hold it together. The air was thick with loss, pressing down on his chest until every breath felt like labor. "This place," he said quietly, "feels cursed." Cross glanced at him. Or it was made to be. She closed her notebook and scanned the vehicles stacked around them. If these were just accidents, you'd expect chaos. But this is intentional, organized, like someone didn't want the world to find them, but also couldn't help making it into something methodical. Like they wanted to hide it, but also leave a pattern, Jake asked. Exactly. Jake turned in place, looking at the rows of cars. The longer he stared, the more it felt like a monument. Not one built to honor, but to erase. "You think we'll find out who did this?" he asked. Cross nodded. "I do. We have leads now. Locations, timelines, vehicle data. Once we trace which cars went missing when and where, we might find an overlap." A pattern. Jake didn't respond. He just kept looking at the Honda, the car that had once carried the people he loved. Now it was a coffin. Above them, the light shifted as clouds drifted across the sun. The floodlights buzzed louder for a moment, and someone called down from the rim. The voices were distant, like they belonged to a different world. Jake reached out and rested his hand on the roof of the car one last time. "I'm ready to go up," he said. Cross gave a small nod, signaling the team above. And as they were hoisted back up toward the sky, toward the question still unanswered, Jake knew one thing for certain. Whatever lay ahead, he wouldn't stop until he uncovered the truth. "We can trace their path," Jake said. "See if they made it that far, ask around. Maybe someone remembers them." Before Cross could respond, a sharp voice cut through the quiet. One of the forensic technicians was leaning over the rim of the sinkhole, calling down. "Detective Cross, we found something. You need to see this." Cross and Jake exchanged a glance. She nodded. "Let's go." The climb back to the surface felt twice as long. Jake's muscles ached from the descent, but it wasn't just the physical strain making his legs shake. Everything about this forest felt wrong. Like the trees had been holding a secret too long and were now heavy with the weight of it. At the top, the technician motioned them toward a section of the forest floor, about 50 yards from the sinkhole. Fallen leaves and debris had been cleared away, revealing packed earth and odd depressions in the ground. "We were expanding the search perimeter when we noticed this," he said. Jake looked down. In the center of the clearing was a fire ring, stones stacked in a circle and partially buried under years of forest detritus. Around it were scattered fragments of rusted cookware, what looked like an old camping lantern, and, farther back, something that froze the breath in Jake's throat. A small wooden cross, no more than 2 feet tall, wedged into the earth at an angle. It was crude and weathered, gray with age, as if it had been carved in haste. No names, no dates. Just a silent marker in the middle of nowhere. Cross knelt beside it, brushing dirt away from the base. "How many?" she asked quietly. The technician pointed toward the woods. "We've found 6 so far, all arranged in a rough line, about 20 feet apart, like grave markers." Jake stared at the crosses, trying to process what he was seeing. 6 wooden markers, 6 potential families, all lost, all dumped here without a trace. It was a cemetery, hidden in the shadows of Kentucky's forgotten woods. "How many people have died here?" Jake whispered. "How many more are still buried?" "We're going to need cadaver dogs," Cross said, "and a full archaeological team. This goes deeper than we thought." As if her words summoned fate, Jake's phone rang, an abrupt, sharp sound that broke the forest's heavy silence. He almost didn't answer, but the caller ID showed a local number. Something told him to pick up. "Jake Morrison." "Jake, it's Carol," came a familiar voice, tight with anxiety. "I just saw the news. They found your family's car. Is it true?" Jake looked around. The crime scene tape, the technicians combing the soil, the dark chasm that had swallowed his past. "Yeah, Aunt Carol, it's true." "Oh, honey," her voice cracked. "After all these years? Are you okay? Where are you?" "I'm here, at the site with the police. They're still processing everything." There was a pause on the line. Then Carol said something that made Jake's stomach tighten. "You know, this is probably nothing," she said. "But I was going through some old boxes last night and I found something that's been bothering me. A receipt from that car dealership. The one where your dad bought the Honda. Rick Brennan's place." Jake felt a chill slide down his spine. "What about it?" "Well, the receipt says they bought the car on July 15th. But I could have sworn David told me they bought it in June. I remember because we were talking about the camping trip. He said he wanted to take the new car." Jake's pulse quickened. So the car was newer than we thought? Exactly. If they bought it mid-July and left in August, they only had it for a few weeks. Doesn't it seem strange to take a brand new car on a long road trip through the mountains? Jake was quiet for a beat. Carol, do you remember anything else? Anything unusual that summer? There was a long pause, then, actually, yes. Your dad seemed tense, like something was bothering him. I asked about it, and he brushed it off, said something about car trouble, but that didn't make sense, not with a new car. When Jake hung up, he headed straight to where Detective Cross was coordinating the scene. Her brow furrowed when she saw his expression. Everything okay? I don't think my family's disappearance was random, Jake said. I think someone they knew, someone they trusted, was involved. Cross raised an eyebrow. Why do you say that? Jake told her everything, the dealership receipt, the purchase date discrepancy, and his dad's behavior before the trip. You think the car dealer had something to do with it? She asked. I don't know, but if my dad was worried and it had to do with the car, maybe Brennan knew more than he should have. He'd know where they lived, when they bought the car, where they planned to go. Cross nodded slowly. Car dealers ask about trips, maintenance schedules. It would have come up. She pulled out her phone. I'll get someone to run a full background check on Richard Brennan and his dealership, business records, employee rosters, and complaint history. Let's see what shakes loose. As she made the call, Jake turned and stared back at the sinkhole. It yawned silently behind them, swallowing light and sound. Somewhere beneath the rusted steel and crushed memories were answers to 20 years of questions. But Jake was starting to realize the real truth wasn't down there at all. It was in people's basements, in yellowing papers, in half-forgotten stories told by relatives who never imagined they might hold the key. The secrets weren't buried. They were hiding in plain sight. That was going to change. Starting now. By the time they returned to the Bowling Green police station, the sun was dipping low on the horizon. It was just past 6 p.m. Jake's clothes reeked of rust and earth. His mind replayed every moment, especially the image that haunted him most. 6 crude wooden crosses in a quiet glade. 6 families who never made it home. Cross led him into a small conference room off the main hallway. The fluorescent lights above cast everything in an unforgiving glare, bleaching the colors from the world, making even the walls look sterile and cold. Jake sat down slowly, every joint aching with exhaustion. But his mind was sharper than it had been in years. As he sat there, Jake couldn't help but think of how different this room felt compared to the raw forest outside. Here, everything was sterile, controlled. There were no twisted metal ruins, no makeshift graves. But the fluorescent hum reminded him of hospital visits, of police waiting rooms, of the places people sat when their lives were falling apart. Cross stepped out for a moment, saying she needed to check in with the lead forensics officer. Jake leaned forward, elbows on the table, staring at his dirt-caked hands. His fingernails were blackened, grime embedded in every crease. He didn't recognize them. They looked like the hands of someone who had dug up ghosts. A knock at the door startled him. A young officer entered with a bottle of water and a warm paper-wrapped sandwich. Figured you could use something, she said softly, placing them in front of him. Thanks, he murmured. He wasn't hungry, but he unwrapped the sandwich anyway. The smell of grilled bread and cheese filled the room. A normal smell. Something from the world before all of this. Cross returned a few minutes later, her face unreadable but focused. I spoke with one of our analysts, she said, sitting down across from him. They're pulling every public record they can find on Rick Brennan and his dealership. Tax filings, real estate holdings, and business permits. If there's a connection to any of these families, or if the car was altered before sale, we'll find it. Jake nodded, still gripping the bottle of water. Thank you. She studied him for a long moment. This is going to be bigger than we thought, Jake. I don't want to give you false hope, but if we can connect your family to others, we can stop whoever did this, he finished for her. Cross gave a tight nod. Exactly, but we'll need your help, Every memory, every scrap of information you can give us about that summer, about your dad, your mom, your sisters. Anything out of the ordinary. Jake looked down at his hands again. I've already started remembering things I thought I'd forgotten. Little details, like how Dad double-checked the tire pressure twice that week, or how Mom bought new sleeping bags, even though we had perfectly good ones. Those kinds of details matter more than you know, Cross said. Jake leaned back in the chair. He was tired, but beneath the exhaustion was a flame that hadn't burned in decades. Not hope, not yet, but purpose. They were going to find the truth, no matter how long it took. She spread out a thick stack of files across the table, each one heavy with the weight of loss. Jake dropped into a molded plastic chair, its rigidity no match for the fatigue coursing through his limbs. Coffee? Cross offered. He nodded silently. Anything to occupy his hands. Anything to warm the chill that had gripped him since the moment he stood at the edge of that mechanical graveyard. While she stepped out to fetch it, Jake stared at the open folders scattered before him. Missing persons reports, coroner notes, police photos, incident summaries. These weren't just documents. They were testaments to entire lives abruptly severed, stories cut short by something monstrous and invisible. Cross returned with 2 steaming cups. The coffee smelled like it had spent all day simmering into bitterness. But Jake welcomed the sting on his tongue. She slid into the seat across from him, her demeanor focused but gentle. I just got word from my contact, she said, setting her cup aside. The one who ran the background check on Richard Brennan. Jake sat forward. What did they find? Brennan's auto sales has been around since 1987, Cross began. On the surface, it's squeaky clean. No complaints with the Better Business Bureau. Taxes filed like clockwork. No lawsuits, no recalls, no red flags. On the surface, Jake echoed. Cross opened a manila folder, pulling out several pages. But when we dig deeper, the cracks start showing. Between 1995 and 2005, Brennan sold vehicles to at least a dozen families who later vanished under unusual circumstances. Jake's breath caught. 12? She nodded. The Hendersons. The Martinez family vanished en route to the Great Smoky Mountains in 2001. The Thompsons, who disappeared on a drive to Florida in 2003. All of them had one thing in common. They bought their last vehicle from Brennan within 6 months of disappearing. She laid out photographs. Smiling families in front of fresh paint jobs, clean tires, cheerful grins outside Brennan's dealership. Jake stared, bile rising in his throat. They look happy, he whispered, completely unaware they were posing in front of their death sentence. It's not a coincidence, Cross said. But Brennan wasn't acting alone. A scheme like this, spanning over a decade, crossing state lines, it takes infrastructure, coordination, people in law enforcement, insurance, maybe even the courts. She opened another folder, pulling out pages marked with seals and signatures. I also pulled records from your family's original investigation, she said. The lead detective? Sheriff Dale Hutchkins. Retired in 2010 and relocated to Florida. But while he was in office, his department had the highest rate of unsolved missing persons cases in the state. Jake's jaw tensed. How high? In a county that should average 1 or 2 per year, Cross said. His department logged 47 unsolved family disappearances between 1995 and 2010. All travelers, all on the move, all passing through. Jake's coffee cup trembled in his hand as he set it down. 47? And that's just the ones we know of. I also accessed vehicle insurance records. Every car pulled from the sinkhole, fully insured, comprehensive coverage, generous payouts, the claims, all processed quickly and without dispute. Jake looked at her, the pieces clicking into place. Who handled those? A regional adjuster from Hartwell Insurance Group. Margaret Pierce. She authorized over $3 million in payouts for vehicles reported stolen or missing in this exact stretch of Kentucky. From 1995 to 2005, Jake slumped back in his chair. $3 million? Split. 3 ways. Brennan identifies the target. Hutchkins intercepts them. Pierce processes the claims. It's a tidy triangle. And if you eliminate the families, there's no one left to file a report. Jake finished. No one is asking questions. Exactly, Cross said. Efficient, ruthless, and until now, undetected. Jake stood abruptly and walked to the window. Outside, the station's parking lot buzzed beneath yellow sodium lights. Normalcy. People picking up fast food, going home, making plans. They had no idea the world could be so cruel, so calculated. Behind him, Cross's voice dropped lower. There's something else. You're not going to like it. Jake turned. What? I called Turner's travel stop, the one you said your family always visited on the way to Mammoth Cave. I spoke to Bill Turner. He's owned it since the mid-'80s, remembers regular customers. Jake nodded. We stopped there every summer. Mom loved their pies. Well, Cross said, he remembers you. Said your family came in every year like clockwork. But in August of 1998, he never saw them. Jake felt the floor tilt. What do you mean? It's only about 90 miles south of Columbus. If they left around 8 in the morning, they'd have arrived by early afternoon, Cross said. But Turner swears they never came in. He even checked his logs from that week. Nothing. They were intercepted before they even made it halfway. Exactly, she said. She unfurled a highway map across the table, tracing a path with her finger. There's a stretch of Highway 31E that snakes through some dense, remote terrain. No surveillance, few homes, dozens of side roads leading to nowhere. She pointed to a forested bend. If Hutchkins wanted a clean pullover with no witnesses, this is where it would happen. Jake stared at the map, at the jagged black line that might as well have been a scalpel across his family's life. They never even had a chance. Cross gave him a moment, then said gently, Jake, this is more than a murder conspiracy. It's a cover-up, rooted deep in institutions people are supposed to trust. And no one ever suspected? He asked bitterly. They were careful, she said. They targeted travelers, not locals. People who wouldn't be missed immediately. They spread the crimes out over the years and jurisdictions. That's why they got away with it. But not anymore, Jake said. Not now. Cross nodded. We're going to bring this to light. All of it. Every name. Every lie. Jake looked down at the photos on the table. Faces frozen in time. All sharing one thing in common. The fatal mistake of trusting a friendly smile at a used car lot. He wouldn't let their stories end in silence. Not while he still had breath. The room fell into a thoughtful silence. Jake traced one of the maps with his finger, following the winding route his family had likely taken that day. The bends in the road, the narrowing stretches of tree-lined asphalt. So many places where a trap could be set, where help would never arrive. Do you think they knew? He asked quietly. My family. Do you think they realized what was happening before it was too late? Cross didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was soft. It's possible, but maybe not. If it was a traffic stop, they probably didn't suspect anything until it was already too late to react. Jake nodded, jaw clenched. They must have been so scared. We're going to make this right, she said. That's a promise. Outside, the night was settling deep over Bowling Green, but in that room, something had shifted. What had begun as a drone sighting and an old cold case was now unraveling into something vast and dark, an operation that had hidden in plain sight, feeding off trust, routine, and silence. But now someone was listening, and someone was going to answer for it. Jake could picture it so clearly, it made his stomach twist. His father easing the car to the shoulder when the flashing lights appeared behind them, probably irritated at the interruption, but not alarmed. His mother, always prepared, dug through her purse to retrieve the registration and insurance card. Sarah likely sighed in exaggerated teenage frustration, muttering about how this would make them late. Jenny, clutching her stuffed elephant, eyes wide, asked in that small voice if they were in trouble. None of them knew they were about to disappear forever. "I want to see Brennan," Jake said suddenly, voice tight. Detective Cross looked up from the map she'd been examining. "What?" "Rick Brennan," Jake repeated. "I want to talk to him, face to face." Cross's expression shifted, her posture stiffening. "Jake, I get it. You're angry." "He sold my family the car that got them killed. He knew they were going camping. He probably handed their itinerary over to Hutchkins like it was nothing. Address, route, and time of departure, all of it." Jake's voice rose with every word. "He smiled at us and shook my dad's hand and sent them to their deaths." "Even if that's true, confronting him without a plan won't help," Cross said calmly. "You want justice, not a mistrial." Jake was on his feet now, pacing, his fists clenching and unclenching. "So what? We just sit here studying paper while he lives like nothing ever happened? 20 years, Cross. 20. While he's been eating dinner at his kitchen table, my family's been decomposing in a pit." Cross let him pace for a beat, then said, "What if I told you Brennan might not be sleeping as well as you think?" Jake paused. "What do you mean?" "Margaret Pierce died in a crash 3 years ago. Dale Hutchkins, heart attack last spring. That leaves Brennan. He's the last thread holding the whole thing together, and he might be feeling the heat." Jake's breath caught in his chest. "So he knows." "He might suspect," Cross said, "and that gives us leverage." Jake slowly sat back down, the rage still simmering in his eyes. "So what's the move?" "We don't go in guns blazing. We play it smart. We use his nerves against him. If he thinks we're about to crack this thing wide open, he might want to make a deal, especially if he thinks someone else will take the fall, unless he speaks first." Jake nodded slowly. "You think he'll talk?" Cross gave a small, grim smile. "I think he's going to be very surprised to learn what we've already uncovered." She began stacking the files neatly. "But first, we need to loop in the FBI. This is way bigger than a state case. We're talking about interstate crime, federal insurance fraud, and serial murder. They'll want jurisdiction." Jake swallowed. "How long does that take? A day? Maybe 2. I've already called the Louisville field office. They're sending agents tomorrow." Jake nodded again, though his foot tapped restlessly against the linoleum. The idea of waiting, of letting Brennan breathe free even one more night, gnawed at his insides. After everything he'd seen, after all the time lost, patience felt like cruelty. Cross noticed. "There is something you can do in the meantime," she said. "What?" "Go home, rest, and start thinking about what you want to say to the man who may have orchestrated your family's murder." Jake didn't respond, but he didn't argue either. By the time he left the station, the sun was melting behind the hills, streaking the Kentucky sky with gold and deep crimson. He drove the 4 hours back to Columbus in silence, the road blurring into a monotonous gray ribbon beneath his tires. Every turn of the wheel carried the weight of memories and the unbearable pressure of truth, inching closer. That night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that turned cold by the hour, and a legal pad filled with notes, recollections, and questions. The name Rick Brennan was circled 3 times on the first page. Jake remembered the man vividly. Brennan had been a fixture in their community, always around, always friendly. His dealership sat on a well-traveled corner of Main Street, draped in rows of fluttering flags and pastel-colored balloons. On summer nights, the smell of grilled hot dogs and popcorn would waft from the weekend promotions he hosted. People liked Brennan, trusted him. Jake's father had liked him too. He remembered that specific Saturday in July. The heat was unbearable, the kind that made the pavement soft underfoot and left sweat clinging to everything. His dad had finally decided to trade in their ailing Buick. "Let's go see what Rick's got," he'd said. Jake had tagged along, 15 years old, curious more about CD players and bucket seats than safety ratings. Brennan had greeted them with a wide grin and a hearty clap on the back. "Dave Morrison," he'd said like a politician on the campaign trail. "Heard you're in the market for something reliable." Something road trip worthy, am I right? Family tradition, Jake's dad had replied. Heading down to Mammoth Cave again next month. Ah, love that place, Brennan had said. Got just the car for you. He led them straight to the yellow Honda Accord. Immaculate, low mileage. Garage kept, as Brennan liked to say. Safe, efficient, roomy, perfect for your kind of trips. Jake had stood nearby, arms crossed, watching as the adults talked price and paperwork. Brennan had winked at him once, a little too knowingly. It hadn't meant anything then, but now it meant everything. That wasn't a salesman making conversation. That was a predator marking a target. Jake's hand tightened around the pen. He wrote down every detail he could remember. Brennan's tone, his wording, the way he had known the family's vacation habits with unsettling precision, and most important, the way Brennan had asked, "Still heading to Mammoth Cave this year?" It hadn't been casual. It had been confirmed. Jake flipped to a new page and started a list. People who might have heard that conversation, witnesses, anyone who might have known what Brennan knew. Because if Brennan had shared that information with Hutchkins, there might be a trail, however faint, leading back to that moment on the lot. In the quiet of the night, with only the ticking of the kitchen clock for company, Jake pressed his palm against the notepad. He wasn't a detective. He wasn't a lawyer. But he was the last Morrison left, and that was enough. He stood up, stretched the stiffness from his spine, and walked into the garage. It still looked the way it had in his childhood. Organized chaos. Pegboards lined the walls, filled with neatly hung tools. His father's red toolbox sat in the same corner, paint-flecked and edges dented from years of use. Jake knelt beside it and opened the lid. Inside were layers of memory. Screwdrivers, a weathered tape measure, a level with a bubble forever trapped just off-center. He ran a hand across the top of the box, the scent of machine oil and sawdust stirring something deep inside. This was where it had all started. This family, this legacy. And this was where he would begin again. Tomorrow, the questions would finally be asked, and Rick Brennan was going to answer them all, even if it meant tearing down every lie he'd built over the last 2 decades. Even if it meant facing the full truth of what happened on that road all those years ago. Of course, Rick Brennan would remember the Morrison family's annual camping trips. In a small town like theirs, everyone knew everyone, and rituals like that became part of the collective memory. Jake had never questioned it before, but now, as he sat in the harsh glare of the kitchen overhead light, scratching out every detail he could recall, a darker realization settled in. Brennan hadn't just been friendly. He'd been observant, calculating, gathering data under the guise of neighborly interest. He'd known how many were in the family, their travel preferences, and the routes they favored. Harmless questions, until they weren't. Jake had barely dozed off when his phone rang, slicing through the pre-dawn quiet like a blade. He jerked upright, heart racing. "Jake!" came Cross's voice, clipped and awake. "Did you get any sleep?" "Not much," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "You?" "About 3 hours. Listen, the FBI team's here. Agent Torres wants to meet you before we make a move on Brennan." "When?" "Now, if you can swing it. We're at the Bowling Green station." Jake was already out of his chair, grabbing his keys. "I'll be there in 4 hours. Drive carefully, and Jake, bring those notes. I can tell. You remembered something." The drive blurred by in a churn of thoughts, caffeine, and adrenaline. When he arrived, the Bowling Green station was buzzing with more personnel than usual. Inside, 3 FBI agents waited, dressed in sharp, dark suits that made them seem like fixtures in a crime drama. But there was nothing theatrical about their presence. The lead agent, Frank Torres, looked like someone who'd seen the worst of what people could do to each other and still managed to keep going. Late 50s, salt and pepper hair, and a calm that felt like steel under pressure. "I've reviewed the files Detective Cross shared," Torres said after introductions. "This case spans state lines, involves systematic insurance fraud, and now potentially mass homicide." Jake leaned forward. What kind of penalties are we talking about? For the fraud alone, Torres said. 20 years, minimum, but if we can establish that the murders were committed in support of the fraud, we're looking at federal capital crimes, death penalty cases. He opened his laptop and rotated it toward the table. A satellite image appeared, showing the forest sinkhole from above. Dozens of vehicles appeared as faint oblongs, clustered like ants in a disturbed colony. Red pins dotted many of them. 60 vehicles conservatively, Torres continued. If each represents a family, we're talking about as many as 200 victims. Mothers, fathers, kids. The number landed like a blow to Jake's gut. We need Brennan to talk, Torres said. But we need to get close without spooking him. If he bolts or destroys evidence. Cross tapped a pen against her pad. We use Jake. Torres raised an eyebrow. How? Rick sold Jake's family the car. He remembers him. I'd bet money on it. Jake goes in, says the car turned, and he's looking for answers. Nothing threatening, just the grief of a son finally learning something after 2 decades. You want me to lie to him? Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. To stay quiet about what you know, Cross clarified. Not forever, just long enough to let him talk. And what if he doesn't say anything useful? He will, Cross said. Men like Brennan always think they're smarter than everyone else. He'll underestimate you. Just be natural, curious. Let him think he's still in control. The next 2 hours were spent rehearsing. Jake would wear a transmitter, barely the size of a postage stamp, under his shirt. Cross and Torres would be parked nearby, listening in. If anything went wrong, they'd step in immediately. They went over his cover story. The police had contacted him about finding the Honda. He just wanted closure. Did Brennan remember the sale? Did his parents say anything unusual? Just innocent questions, at least on the surface. By the time Jake pulled up across from Brennan's auto sales, he felt like his nerves were stretched piano wires. The dealership looked exactly as it had in his memory. Sun-faded string lights dancing in the wind, plastic flags whipping against the July heat, and rows of gleaming used cars. The same hand-painted, "No credit, no problem" sign leaned slightly over the entrance. He scanned the lot. A few customers milled about, and near the office stood a man Jake hadn't seen in 20 years. Older, slower, with more gray than brown in his hair. But the smile was the same, practiced and wide, worn like armor. Jake reached up and touched the transmitter taped to his chest. He took a breath that felt like swallowing broken glass and stepped out of the truck. Brennan saw him immediately. Recognition flickered across his face like a glitch. Surprise, confusion, then something else. Fear, maybe. Or memory. Well, I'll be damned, Brennan said, walking toward him. Jake Morrison, haven't seen you in years. You've grown up some. Hi, Rick, Jake said, careful to keep his voice neutral. Yeah, it's been a while. Must be what? 15 years? 20? Brennan's smile never wavered, but Jake noticed how tightly his hands were clasped behind his back. What brings you by? Finally ready to buy a car of your own? Actually, Jake said slowly, I came to ask about a car you sold my family. A yellow Honda Accord. Back in '98. There, just a hint, a slight shift in Brennan's eyes. His mouth twitched, barely, before he recovered. The Honda, Brennan repeated. Yeah, I remember that one. Your dad was a good man. What a terrible thing that was. Jake nodded. The police found it recently, in a sinkhole down in Kentucky. Brennan blinked. That's that, so? After all these years? Yeah, they said it was in pretty bad shape, but they're trying to piece together what happened. I'm just trying to understand. You remember anything from the sale? Anything they said about their trip? Brennan hesitated for a breath. Your dad mentioned going camping, said he wanted something reliable. That car was clean. One owner. I even gave him a discount, because it was you guys. Jake nodded again, letting the silence stretch just long enough to feel uncomfortable. You ever wonder what happened to them? All the time, Brennan said. Too quickly. Jake offered a thin smile. Yeah, me too. Brennan glanced around the lot, then gestured toward the office. Come on in. Let's talk inside. Out of this heat. Jake hesitated, then nodded. Sure. Inside the office, the air conditioner rattled in the corner, barely keeping up with the summer sun. The walls were cluttered with certificates, dealership awards, and photos of smiling families standing beside their newly purchased cars. Families that might have never made it home. Jake took a seat in one of the cracked vinyl chairs across from Brennan's desk. The man sat slowly, watching Jake with something colder than curiosity. You said they found the car, Brennan prompted. Anything else? Jake shrugged, feigning frustration. Not really. No bodies, just rusted metal. Sinkhole swallowed it all. Brennan scratched his chin. Damn shame. At least maybe now you'll get some answers, huh? Jake stared at him. That's what I'm hoping. Brennan forced a chuckle. Life's strange, ain't it? Jake leaned in slightly. Have you ever heard about other families going missing like that? Around here, I mean. Brennan's smile faltered again. Now and then, people get turned around. Accidents. It happens. Jake held his gaze. But not whole families. Not for 20 years. That hung in the air between them, brittle and electric. Brennan stood abruptly. Tell you what, I'll see if I still have the paperwork from that sale. It might be in storage. You want me to look? Jake nodded slowly. Yeah, that'd be helpful. Brennan disappeared into the back office. Jake could hear drawers opening, papers shifting. Every second felt stretched. He tapped the transmitter once to confirm he was still being heard. When Brennan returned, his face was unreadable. No luck, he said. Too long ago. Sorry, Jake. But Jake didn't believe him. Not for a second. And neither did Cross. Because even the best liars leave a trail. And this time, they were ready to follow it. What happened to them? That's what I wanted to talk to you about, Jake said quietly. The police found the car. Rick Brennan's smile faltered for the briefest second, a flicker of tension passing through his eyes. Found it. Where? In a sinkhole, Jake replied, his tone steady. About 60 miles from Mammoth Cave. It had been there for 20 years. He watched Brennan closely, studying every twitch of muscle, every flicker of unease. Brennan's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. They think it might help them figure out what happened to my family. Well, that's... Brennan paused, licking his lips. That's good news, I suppose. I mean, not good, obviously, but closure, you know. Jake noticed the sweat forming on Brennan's forehead despite the cool air. It was early, the sun barely warming the pavement, and still, Brennan looked like he'd just run a mile. That was all the confirmation Jake needed. Did they find your family? They're still looking, Jake said. But I was hoping you might remember something about the sale. Anything my dad might have said about their trip or where they were going. Brennan nodded, his brow furrowed in what could have passed for thoughtful concern. Your dad was excited about that car. Said it would be perfect for camping trips. Mentioned they were heading down to Kentucky. Mammoth Cave, I think. That's right, Jake said carefully. Did he mention anything else about the route they were taking or when they were leaving? Oh, that was a long time ago. Brennan gave a little shrug, trying to play casual. I sell a lot of cars, you know. Hard to remember every conversation. His glance shifted toward the office, a nervous tick Jake didn't miss. But I think he mentioned they always took the same route. Highway 31E, wasn't it? Said it was scenic. The temperature in Jake's blood dropped. That route was exactly where Detective Cross believed his family had been intercepted. There was no reason for Brennan to remember that, unless he was involved. Unless that detail had been important to him for reasons that had nothing to do with good customer service. Yeah, Jake said, keeping his tone steady. That sounds right. He let the silence hang, then added, Did anyone else know about their travel plans? Other customers, maybe? People my dad might have talked to while he was here. Brennan's eyes flicked toward the street, scanning, searching. His discomfort was growing more obvious by the second. Can't say that I recall, he said with forced lightness. Like I said, A long time ago. I'm sure the police will figure it all out now that they found the car. Modern forensics is amazing what they can do nowadays. I hope so, Jake replied. My family deserves justice. Of course they do, of course. Brennan began edging toward his office. Well, it was good seeing you, Jake. I hope you get the answers you're looking for. Actually, Jake said, stopping him, there's one more thing. Do you have any records from that sale? Paperwork, maybe? The police asked me to check if there's any documentation. Brennan stopped. His shoulders stiffened, and for a long moment, he didn't turn around. When he finally did, the smile was gone. You know, Jake, he said softly, sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie. Your family's been gone a long time. Maybe it's time to let them rest in peace. Jake's pulse spiked. What's that supposed to mean? It means some questions are better left unasked. Some stones are better left unturned. Brennan's voice had gone low, almost a whisper. You understand what I'm saying? Jake felt the transmitter taped to his chest. Every word was being recorded, transmitted in real time to the agents listening nearby. Are you threatening me, Rick? Brennan let out a hollow chuckle. Threatening? No, son. I'm giving you some friendly advice. The same I'd give anyone poking around in dangerous territory. He turned toward the office again, but paused at the door. You've got a nice life, Jake. A good business, from what I hear. Be a shame if anything happened to disturb that peace you've built. Then he disappeared inside, leaving Jake standing alone among the rows of brightly tagged used cars and their false promises. But Jake wasn't alone. In his earpiece, Detective Cross's voice came through steady and calm. We got him. That was as good as a confession. Move away from the lot. We're coming in. Jake stepped off the curb, crossing the street just as the flurry began behind him. Car doors slammed, radios crackled. Agents and officers swarmed Brennan's auto sales in a coordinated push, their vehicles forming a tight perimeter. Jake turned to see Brennan through the window of his office, mid-call, his face pale, mouth moving rapidly, free hand gesturing wildly. Whatever calm facade he had managed earlier was gone now. Agent Torres appeared at Jake's side. You did well in there. His reaction when you mentioned Highway 31E was telling. He remembered way too much for a 20-year-old sale, Jake said, and that veiled threat. Sealed the deal, Torres replied. We've got enough for a search warrant and probable cause for arrest. Torres turned toward the office window. Only question now is, who's he calling? Cross joined them, pulling off her earpiece. 3 minutes on that line. Could be a lawyer. Could be someone else in the ring. Or someone who can wipe evidence, Torres said grimly. He reached for his radio. All units, move in. Secure the suspect and all communication devices immediately. Jake watched as agents breached the office. Brennan didn't resist, just sat there, blinking in disbelief, as one agent took the phone from his hand and another clapped him in cuffs. What happens now? Jake asked. Now we search everything, Torres said. Business records, emails, computer backups. If Brennan left a breadcrumb trail, we'll find it. And if he didn't, Cross answered this time, then we lean on the recording. A man like Brennan, facing life, or worse, for federal murder charges? He'll talk. Most people do. Jake took a step back from the building, heart still racing. The tension that had gripped him inside Brennan's office hadn't fully released. Even with Brennan in custody, the threat still hung heavy in the AR, like there were more pieces to this puzzle hidden just out of reach. Torres made a few quick calls, barking orders to incoming forensic units. We'll tear that place apart if we have to. Bank records, internal memos, anything that connects him to the disappearances. Cross walked beside Jake, her expression unreadable. This was just the beginning, she said. People like Brennan don't act alone. He wasn't the mastermind. He was a node in the network. If he's smart, he'll talk. Jake nodded, trying to anchor himself. You think there are more of them? Cross looked back toward the dealership, where agents were already stringing yellow tape across the entrance. I'd bet my badge on it. Whoever helped him cover up this operation, law enforcement, insurance, transportation, they've had 20 years to build this into something deep. The thought was overwhelming. But Jake had no intention of walking away now. Not after seeing that sinkhole. Not after reading the words scratched into the glass of the Honda. "Help us." As Cross stepped away to coordinate with another agent, Jake found himself staring at the dealership again. The flags still waved, cheerful and oblivious. The painted signs still promised "no credit," "no problem," in faded block letters. But beneath the ordinary exterior, the rot had festered for decades. And now, for the first time, it was being exposed to daylight. The search of Brennan's auto sales stretched into its 6th grueling hour. Jake sat across the street, his knees pressed uncomfortably against the steering wheel. Through the open window, he watched FBI technicians haul out heavy boxes labeled files, ledgers, hard drives. Agents painstakingly dismantled every corner of the office, raising floorboards, pulling shelves, and testing walls for hidden compartments. Each shift of paper or hum of equipment was like a distant tick, echoing through Jake's chest. At precisely noon, Detective Cross appeared at his driver's side window, her shirt sleeves rolled up, and her hair dusted with sweat. The hard edges of exhaustion showed in the lines of her face, but her posture remained steady, resilient. "You should grab something to eat," she said gently, tapping the glass. "This is going to run all day, if not longer." Jake's jaw tensed as he looked back at the office, already emptied to the bare frame. "I'm not leaving," he said in a low voice. "Not until I know what they found in there." Cross took a long breath before smoothing a hand across the hood where she leaned. "Okay, but—" She hesitated, her tone softening. "Can I ask you something?" He turned the key in the ignition but left the engine off. "Shoot." Cross watched him for a moment. "When this is over, after we arrest everyone involved and close the case, what happens to you?" Jake closed his eyes. He hadn't thought that far. For 2 decades, the mystery of his family's disappearance had shaped every day of his life. The silence at birthdays, the empty seats at Christmas, the ache that refused to fade. Without that question hanging over him, what was left? "I don't know," he admitted, voice tight. "I guess I'll figure it out when I have to." Cross nodded, her gaze drifting across the lot, where crates were being loaded into vans. There are other families out there, other parents, brothers, sisters, still waiting for answers. The Hendersons, the Yamamotos, the Martinez family. They've waited as long as you have. Jake looked at her, listening. "What are you saying?" Cross exhaled, compassion and urgency threading through her words. "I'm saying, you're good at this. You've been through it. You know what this feels like. You could help solve other cold cases. You have instincts. And a few of these families, hell, every one of them, could use someone who cares as much as you do." He didn't respond. Her words circled his mind as Agent Torres finally emerged from Brennan's office, carrying a battered laptop bag and a grin that looked out of place at first against the somber scene. "We found something," Torres said as he strode to the truck, setting the bag down on the hood. "Something you'll want to see." She and Jake joined him around the hood, where he carefully unzipped the bag and withdrew a thick manila folder crammed full of sheets, spreadsheets, and carefully organized documents. Nan, a likely moniker or alias, kept detailed records, not just of the Honda sale, but the entire operation, Torres explained. Customer profiles, travel itineraries, route maps, payout ledgers, all of it. Jake's breath caught. "Show me," he said, voice barely more than a whisper. Torres handed him the first sheet, printed on crisp white paper. At the top, Jake's family name. Beneath, parents, ages, address, make model, and details of the 1996 Honda Accord. Then, in columns, departure date, August 15th, 1998. Destination, Green River Campground, Mammoth Cave National Park. Route, Y31E, south to Route 70 west. Turner's travel stop ETA 1:30 p.m. Intercept point. Mile marker 127. Y31E. Assets, vehicle, camping gear, approx. $800 cash. Insurance value, $45,000. Jake's hand trembled as he read. They had parsed out his family's trip down to the minute and the mile. What had seemed like random tragedy was, instead, ominous precision. They planned every detail, Torres said quietly. He handed over another document. This is the post-op report. Jake scanned the terse entries. Operation complete. Assets disposed of, claim filed, payout distributed. His breath caught at the terminology. Mechanical, emotionless. Like a business transaction, he said softly. Torres nodded. Exactly. A brutal ledger that reduced human lives to assets. Cross peered over Jake's shoulder. There are 43 of these documentation packets, families from 1995 to 2005, everyone matching an unsolved disappearance. Jake clutched the folder in his lap. Why would Brennan keep these? He asked. Doesn't he realize how incriminating it is? Insurance fraud requires paperwork, Torres replied. It's how they justify claims. At the center, these men thought records kept them safe. Cross tapped her pen. Criminals always think they're smarter than they are. They keep trophies. Jake swallowed hard. The gravity of it was suffocating. 43 families, hundreds of victims. His family just one line in the ledger. Where are the bodies? He asked, voice cracking. Torres's face darkened. That's the one thing Brennan didn't log. We know the financials and the route, but not the final disposal sites. Not yet. But now, he added resolutely, we have leverage. Brennan is now looking at federal murder charges, maybe the death penalty. He'll talk. At that moment, another FBI agent appeared, a handheld phone in hand. Agent Torres, Brennan wants to speak to you. A grim smile spread across Torres's face. That was fast. Bring him in, and get his lawyer on the line. He's going to need one. Two hours later, in a bleak room monitored through a one-way mirror, Jake watched Brennan sit with his counsel. The same man who earlier wore confidence like armor now appeared aged, destabilized, his hands shaking as he lifted a cup of water. Across the table, Torres and Cross stayed at attention, files stacked neatly before them. Torres broke the silence. Let's start simple. How many families did you kill? The lawyer leaned forward. My client will cooperate fully, but only if he's spared the death penalty. Life without parole in exchange. That depends on what he tells us, Torres replied coolly. Richard, tell us the truth. Brennan cleared his throat. His voice trembled. 43 families, he said. 212 people. Even though Jake had read it, hearing the words was like a physical blow. 212 souls. He recalled Jenny's laughter, Sarah's eye rolls, his mother's warm voice, and the terrible knowledge that they were gone. Just lines on browned paper. Cross spoke softly. Those were mothers, fathers, children, entire lives erased. Brennan managed a shaky nod. It wasn't supposed to go this far, he whispered. It started small, just cars, steal, claim, split money, but it spiraled. Partnerships formed, people in law enforcement, insurers, transport drivers. They said if families vanished, no one would notice. Claims processed clean. Torres leaned forward, eyes steely. We need names, locations, everything, every participant. Brennan swallowed. I kept backups, ledgers, contacts. I have files hidden off-site. I'll need protection, witness relocation. Jake's anger coiled inside him. His world had been stolen. Now Brennan was bargaining his life and his secrets. Torres remained calm. If you fully cooperate, you live, maybe sentence served. You become a witness. Brennan closed his eyes, voice hollow. Fine, I'll tell you everything. Cross opened her notebook. Start at the beginning. Where did it start, and who was involved? Behind the mirror, Jake sat motionless, His heart hammered so loudly he wondered if Brennan could hear it in the room. But he stayed. He'd come too far to walk away now. Because now, finally, they would dig up every secret. And maybe, just maybe, bring home the ones who'd been buried by the machinery of greed. "How did the operation work?" Detective Cross asked, leaning forward. Brennan glanced at his attorney, who gave a subtle nod. He took a slow breath before speaking. "I picked the targets. Families with good insurance policies, planning vacations in remote areas. I passed the information to Dale Hutchkins. He'd arranged the stop." "Stopped how?" Cross pressed. Brennan shrugged, his voice flat. "His deputies would pull them over. Maybe a traffic violation, vehicle inspection, something routine. Nothing would raise suspicions." He leaned in, voice dropping to a whisper. "Then they'd be taken somewhere else." Hutchkins had an old hunting cabin in the woods. Detective Cross's eyes sharpened. "That's where," she began. "They were killed there," Agent Torres finished, his words cold and clinical. Brennan nodded in confirmation. Cross asked, "And the bodies?" "Hutchkins took care of that part," Brennan replied softly. "I didn't want to know the details." He paused, voice distant. Cross leaned even closer. "You knew they were being killed?" Brennan gave a small nod. His tone was hollow. "Yes." Cross cleared her throat, then asked, "What about the insurance claims? How did those get handled?" "Margaret Pierce handled them," he said, rubbing his thumb over the edge of the table. "A few weeks after each operation, she'd file a report claiming the vehicle was stolen or involved in a remote accident. The companies paid out. Then we split the money 3 ways, Hutchkins, Pierce, and me." Cross waited for more. "How much money are we talking?" Brennan exchanged a glance with his lawyer before answering. "Around $8 million over 10 years. Jake, who had been quietly absorbing everything, felt his stomach grow cold. His family's lives had been worth about $180,000 to these criminals, barely the cost of a modest home. Rage welled up in him. Agent Torres pulled out a folded map from a briefcase and spread it across the table. "Where is Hutchkins's hunting cabin?" Brennan pointed to a small remote spot about 20 miles northeast of the sinkhole, accessible only via a rough logging road hidden from most maps. He traced the location with a shaking finger and added, "The cabin may have collapsed by now, but the cellar, where the bodies were buried, that still exists." Jake's fists clenched. His breath caught as he pictured the place where his family had been murdered and dumped in a hidden pit. "We need precise coordinates," Torres said. "Draw us a map." Brennan nodded and produced a crudely drawn sketch. "But this was more than just you 3, Cross said quietly. "You worked with Hutchkins, Pierce, but others were involved?" Brennan hesitated, voice tense. "I don't have all the names. Hutchkins kept those details in his own head. But there had to be more. Deputies, even state troopers. You can't process hundreds of bodies without help." Cross and Torres exchanged a quick glance, filled with dark anticipation. "How deep does this go?" she asked. Brennan drew a ragged line on the paper. "Deep enough." He spent the next hour recounting specific incidents, how the victims were chosen, how the routes were scouted, the signal code they used between them. He detailed financial arrangements, logistical challenges, and even how they rotated locations to avoid suspicion. Throughout the interrogation, Jake sat silent, taking mental notes and memorizing every detail. The rational voice inside his head reminded him this was beyond personal. It was a criminal conspiracy that had to be dismantled. Afterward, Torres stepped into the observation room alongside Jake. "We have enough to imprison him for life," Torres said quietly. "But even better, we now know where to find the remains." Jake's voice came out raw. "When do we go?" "First light tomorrow," Torres replied. "We'll bring cadaver dogs, forensic anthropologists, ground-penetrating radar, everything necessary to recover and identify the bodies." Jake stared through the tinted glass at Rick Brennan, hunched over in the interrogation room, head in hands. "I want to be there," he said. "When they find them, I want to be there." Torres nodded. "I thought you would, but brace yourself. After 20 years underground, identification will be tough." We'll rely on dental records and DNA, Jake nodded, voice cracking. I understand, but that's my family. They've been alone down there for 20 years. I need to be there when they come home. The sun hadn't risen yet when they assembled at the station. A convoy of FBI SUVs, Kentucky State Police cruisers, a forensic van, and a truck loaded with radar gear rolled out into the morning. Jake followed them in his own vehicle, not willing to simply watch from the sidelines. The convoy wound its way deep into Daniel Boone National Forest, where paved roads surrendered to narrow, winding dirt trails surrounded by towering hardwoods. Oaks and maples formed a cathedral-like canopy overhead. The air was cool, thick with the smell of damp earth and moss. Every crunch of gravel under tires felt thunderous in the silent forest. Earlier, Torres had suggested that Jake stay behind. A crime scene isn't a place for family, he'd argued. But Cross had stepped in firmly. He's earned the right to be here. 20 years of searching, 2 days, helping us crack the case. He gets to see it through. Torres sighed, but finally agreed. All right, just don't get in the way. They reached the coordinates just after sunrise. Their guide led them to the collapsed remains of what had once been a hunting cabin. Only the foundation stones and an old chimney remained, poking through moss and ivy in a clearing so quiet it felt suspended in time. Dr. Sharon Kim, an FBI forensic anthropologist, approached the rear of the foundation. She knelt and pointed. See that depression? That could be the entrance to the cellar. The ground there was slightly sunken, covered in years of leaf litter. Something dark and ominous hovered beneath. Jake knelt beside Dr. Kim, the morning air cold against his face, his stomach twisted in agony. The forensic team began their work. First, they swept the perimeter with metal detectors, revealing faint signals. Then they deployed ground-penetrating radar units. On small laptops and tablet screens, arcs and shapes blurred beneath the earth, suggestions of hidden remains, distorted by time but unmistakable in implication. Dr. Kim stared at the screens with grave focus. Jake swallowed hard. He felt as if the earth itself had betrayed his family, concealing them for 2 decades. But now, finally, the land would speak again. He closed his eyes, remembering his mother's laugh, his sister Jenny's voice humming in the back seat, Sarah's teenage protests. His father's hand was on the steering wheel. Life as it was, stolen and buried in silence. He touched the cold dirt at his knees. He felt closer to them than he had in years. All set, Doctor, Kim announced softly. We're ready to breach. Jake straightened, breathing slowly. The forensic crew advanced, carefully removing soil by the inch. Layers of decay emerged. Rotted wood fragments, a twisted bit of metal, long-buried contents of a forgotten cabin, evidence of a final stop before tragedy. The lead excavator paused, wiping sweat from her brow. Possible human remains, she said quietly. Jake swallowed, heart pounding. He stood motionless, each breath shallow. The team worked with precision, gloves, masks, tiny instruments. They revealed a scattering of bone fragments, completely obscured by roots and debris. Dr. Kim knelt for examination. Jake watched from a short distance, ears straining to hear his own heartbeat amidst the respectful silence. This is our starting point, Dr. Kim murmured. We'll collect samples, run DNA tests. We might recover multiple individuals, given these coordinates and Brennan's statements. Jake whispered, rarely aloud. Thank you. He circled the excavation, not stepping into it, but close enough to feel it all. He recalled every detail Brennan had shared about his family's trip. The camping supplies, the camper path, the marker-laden highway. All of it converged here. In this forsaken hollow under a collapsed roof and vine-covered ruins, he sensed a long silent story beginning to speak. He counted breaths. 1, 2, 20 years worth of grief and unanswered questions. But today, the tide had turned. Today, families can be found. Today, the silence would break. We've got multiple anomalies that match patterns consistent with human remains, Dr. Kim called out, her voice cutting through the tense quiet of the forest clearing. It appears there may be several burial sites scattered around the cabin ruins. Detective Cross moved closer. How many are we talking about? Dr. Kim frowned at the radar display. Hard to be exact with just surface scans, but there are at least a dozen distinct disturbance zones. There could be more buried deeper or outside our current search perimeter. Jake stood just behind the tape line, watching silently as the forensic team began the painstaking work of excavation. They had marked out a careful grid pattern around the site, and now moved with methodical precision, removing layers of soil inch by inch. Every handful of dirt was sifted, cataloged, and photographed. Jake's construction-trained mind appreciated the discipline and order, but his heart ached for speed. Each second stretched painfully as he waited to see the faces. Well, the proof that this graveyard truly held his family. It was just after noon when the first discovery emerged from the earth. Dr. Kim crouched beside a trench near the collapsed cabin wall, carefully brushing away clumps of damp soil. She looked up and gestured to the others. "I've got textile fragments," she announced. She held up a small plastic evidence bag, inside which were several faded, threadbare scraps of cotton. "Clothing, possibly outerwear." She reached for a second bag. "And this, what looks like a zipper pull, likely from a jacket or sweatshirt." Jake's breath caught. A flood of memory hit him like a wave. His mother had been wearing a blue windbreaker the morning they left. He could still picture her standing in the driveway, zipping it up with one hand while holding a thermos in the other. She debated wearing it at all, but ultimately decided the cool mountain air might make her grateful for the extra layer. "Can you tell how old it is?" Jake asked, his voice tight. Dr. Kim studied the zipper pull through the bag. The corrosion pattern is consistent with about 20 years of underground exposure. The textile degradation also supports that estimate. The digging resumed, slow and relentless. More fabric surfaced, then buttons, and the shriveled remnants of a leather wallet. Whatever identification it once held had long since rotted to nothing. Then came the moment Jake had dreaded and anticipated in equal measure. "I've got bone," Dr. Kim said, softly but firmly. Jake's knees nearly buckled. For 2 decades, he'd been haunted by questions. Were they alive? Had they escaped somehow? Could they have simply vanished by choice? But now, there would be no more room for denial or illusion. Reality stood before him in the form of soil-encrusted bone. "You don't have to watch this," Cross said gently, laying a steady hand on his shoulder. "Yes, I do," Jake replied, his voice hoarse but unwavering. "They're my family. I'm not leaving them alone again." With brushes and dental tools, Dr. Kim began revealing the remains. First came a partial rib cage, then fragments of a skull, followed by the gentle arc of a human spine. Each bone was handled with the reverence of sacred relics. "Adult female," Kim said after careful measurements. "Based on pelvis and skull proportions, estimated height between 5'4" and 5'6". Jake's mother had stood 5'5" exactly. As the afternoon wore on, more remains surfaced. Fragments of limbs, vertebrae, phalanges. Dr. Kim laid each one out on a clean tarp, slowly reconstructing the body like a solemn puzzle. "Any visible trauma?" Agent Torres asked from beside her. She pointed at the skull. Depressed fracture at the occipital bone. Blunt force trauma, likely fatal. Jake turned away, nausea rising. It was one thing to understand that his family had been murdered. It was another entirely to see proof, literal proof, that someone had taken a weapon and shattered his mother's skull. Another technician called out from a nearby section. "There's another site here, near the front porch area." Jake moved toward the new excavation, his stomach clenched tight. The remains that emerged next were smaller, the bones more delicate. "Juvenile," Dr. Kim said softly. "Estimated age, 12 to 14. Jake closed his eyes. Jenny, his little sister, who had waved goodbye from the back seat, clutching her Walkman and promising to bring back a cool rock from Mammoth Cave. His knees hit the dirt, and he stayed there, not crying, not speaking, just holding the earth like it could somehow connect him to her across time. By sundown, the forensics team had recovered remains from 4 individuals, an adult male, an adult female, and 2 children. The configuration and approximate ages matched Jake's family precisely. Still, Dr. Kim cautioned against assuming. "We'll need dental records and DNA testing to be certain," she said. "This is just the beginning. The radar scans show potential burial sites spread across the area. We've got a long way to go." Jake sat on a mossy log, elbows on knees, as the team packed up for the day. The boxes containing the bones, his family's bones most likely, were labeled, sealed, and loaded into the van bound for the FBI's Louisville lab. Detective Cross walked over and sat beside him. "How are you holding up?" she asked. Jake didn't answer at first. He stared out at the forest, at the crime scene tape fluttering like yellow scars across the clearing. "I don't know," he said finally. "For 20 years I imagined 100 endings. I wondered if they were still out there, maybe even happy somewhere. And now I know. They were beaten and buried in a pit like garbage. They never even made it past Turner's travel stop." Cross didn't interrupt. Jake continued, bitterness rising. "I used to tell myself they got away, started a new life maybe. Even if they never came back, I could live with the mystery. But now I know they died scared. Alone. I don't even know if it was quick." Cross exhaled slowly. "What happened to them was evil, but you didn't let them be forgotten. You fought for the truth. You gave them a voice." Jake looked up, eyes rimmed with unshed tears. "This place, this clearing, it's not home. It's just where they were murdered." Cross shook her head gently. "Home isn't just a place. Home is where someone remembers you, where someone won't stop until you're found. Your family's been home with you every day since they disappeared. You carried them with you in every drywall job, every late night, every lonely Christmas." Jake didn't respond. He just stared at the forest as dusk fell, the shadows stretching across the trees like long, silent fingers. In the soil lay answers. In the coming days, there would be names confirmed, causes of death determined, and perpetrators exposed. But tonight, in the hush of the Kentucky woods, surrounded by fallen leaves and rising stars, Jake Morrison sat beside what he now knew was a mass grave, and finally, after 2 decades, began to grieve in truth. They drove back toward Bowling Green as dusk settled across the rolling hills of Kentucky, the landscape cloaked in deepening shadows. Jake followed the convoy's red taillights through the winding roads, each curve echoing with the weight of memories and unanswered questions. His thoughts drifted back over 2 decades of hope, denial, and grief. The truth was now undeniable, but it hadn't brought the relief he'd expected. Back at the Bowling Green police station, Agent Torres met Jake at the entrance, his face somber. "We'll transport the remains to the FBI lab in Louisville," he said. "We've already requested dental records from your family's old dentist. The DNA samples you provided will help with confirmation." "How long will it take?" Jake asked, his voice heavy. "Dental comparison could take a few days. DNA might take several weeks, depending on the condition of the samples." Jake nodded slowly. "And after that? Then the remains will be released to you. You'll be able to bury them properly. Meanwhile, we'll keep building the case against everyone who played a part in this." That night, Jake drove alone to the motel he had been staying at, a nondescript building just off the interstate. Somewhere ahead of him, in a government van escorted by law enforcement, were the remains of his family. After 20 years of not knowing where they were, it was surreal, almost grotesque, to think of them boxed and labeled, their identities reduced to forensic evidence. He entered the room, and its silence was oppressive. The old lamp buzzed softly on the nightstand. The bedspread was wrinkled, the carpet worn thin. Everything smelled faintly of bleach and dust. Jake sat down heavily on the bed and, after a long pause, pulled out his phone. He scrolled to Carol's number and hit call. She answered after the second ring, her voice cautious. "Jake?" "They found them," he said, voice flat. A beat of silence followed. "Are you sure?" she asked finally, her tone fragile, as if hoping the answer could still be no. "Not officially," Jake said, "but the suspects gave us the location. The site matches their statements, the number and size of the bodies. It's them." Carol's breath hitched. He could hear her trying to stay composed, trying not to fall apart for his sake. "I always hoped," she said softly. "It sounds foolish, but I used to imagine they were just somewhere else, alive, safe." "It's not foolish," Jake replied. "I hoped for the same thing, even when I knew better. What happens now?" "Now we wait," he said, "for confirmation, for the lab to tell us what we already know. Then we bury them." After hanging up, Jake sat quietly in the dim motel room. He looked down at his hands. They were still caked with dirt from the excavation site. Under his nails clung the soil that had hidden his family's grave for 2 decades. He hadn't had time or the will to clean it off. Tomorrow, they would return to the cabin site. They'd dig deeper, search wider. More families would be unearthed, victims of greed and betrayal. Arrests would follow. Names would come out. Justice would advance one slow, deliberate step at a time. But tonight, Jake Morrison was just one man, alone, facing the end of a 20-year search. And oddly, a part of him wished he could go back to the days when there was still a sliver of hope. Because as awful as the uncertainty had been, it was nothing compared to this final, crushing truth. At 5:47 a.m., Jake's phone rang. He jolted awake from the first real sleep he'd had in 3 days. He fumbled for the phone, heart pounding. "Jake, it's Dr. Sharon Kim," said a calm, gentle voice. "I wanted to call you myself with the results." Jake sat up slowly, his mind immediately alert. "The dental records are a match," she said. "It's your family." Jake didn't respond right away. He let the words settle like cold lead in his chest. It was final now. Irrevocable. His family wasn't just missing. They were dead, officially, scientifically, undeniably gone. "All 4 of them?" he asked. "Yes, your parents, Sarah and Jenny." "I'm very sorry." After he ended the call, Jake sat in the motel room's quiet darkness, staring at the soft glow under the curtains. The confirmation hadn't brought peace. Instead, it felt like a fresh wound torn open. There would be no miraculous return, no long-lost reunions. They were gone. He was getting dressed when the phone rang again. Detective Cross. "I heard from Dr. Kim," she said. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Jake replied automatically. "You need to know, we found 12 more burial sites yesterday. The radar's picking up anomalies all through that stretch of forest." Jake's stomach twisted. 12 more families. "We believe so. This is bigger than even Brennan admitted. We'll be excavating for weeks, maybe longer." "What about the others? The deputies under Hutchkins? Margaret Pierce?" "Hutchkins is dead. Heart attack last year. But we've reopened files on everyone who worked with him. Anyone who might have been involved, we're not stopping." Jake nodded to himself, a grim sense of resolve settling in. Later that morning, he packed his few belongings, checked out of the motel, and started the long drive back to Columbus. The same roads he'd traveled so often looked different now. He wasn't a man searching for answers anymore. He was someone who had found them, and now had to live with them. As he crossed into Ohio, his phone rang again. It was a number he didn't recognize. "Jake Morrison," he answered. "Hi, this is Michelle Thompson," a woman said hesitantly. I think you found my family." Jake pulled off the road into a rest area, unsure of what he'd just heard. "I'm sorry, what?" "My parents and younger brother vanished in 2003. They were driving to Florida. I saw the news report about the sinkhole, about the families. The reporter mentioned a blue Honda with Pennsylvania plates. Jake's stomach knotted. That detail sounded familiar. Yes, he said carefully. That could have been in the files. I've been calling departments for years, Michelle said, her voice cracking. Everyone told me they probably got into an accident or didn't want to be found. But I knew. Families don't just disappear. No, Jake said quietly. They don't. I spoke with Agent Torres. He said you were the one who broke this open, that you never stopped looking for your family. Jake had no words. He stared out across the parking lot, into the morning sun, heart heavy with grief. And something else. Responsibility. Because now he wasn't just carrying his own pain. He was carrying theirs too. Jake had spent 2 decades immersed in the shadow of his own grief, relentlessly driven by the ache of not knowing. His search had always been personal, singularly focused on finding answers about his own family's disappearance. But as Michelle's voice trembled through the phone, thanking him for the truth and asking what happened next for the others left behind, something shifted. He realized he wasn't alone in his suffering. There were other families, dozens perhaps, still waiting for closure, for answers they feared might never come. I guess we figure it out as we go, Jake replied softly, unsure of what the future held. When the call ended, he didn't start the engine right away. He remained parked at the rest stop, staring at the horizon where families bustled in and out of vehicles, kids laughing, couples chatting, all oblivious to how easily their worlds could be shattered. He watched them with a deepening awareness that what had happened to him could have happened to any of them. One wrong turn, one unlucky encounter, and everything changed forever. Returning home to Columbus, Jake found his house unchanged but unrecognizable. Every room echoed with memories, but they felt distant, almost artificial. The mantel still held family photos, smiling faces frozen in happier times. His father holding a fishing rod, his mother with flour on her cheek from baking pies, Sarah in her graduation gown, and little Jenny clutching her elephant. The photos had once offered comfort. Now they felt like relics from another life. The house had once been a sanctuary, the headquarters of his tireless search. Now it was just walls and furniture. After a shower, Jake answered a call from Agent Torres. Jake, just wanted to update you. We made more arrests this morning. 2 of Hutchkins's former deputies and a state police detective. Brennan's been talking. Jake slumped into his kitchen chair. How many more people were involved? At least 8 confirmed so far, Torres said. This conspiracy was deeper than we thought. Insurance agents, law enforcement, and even county clerks helped falsify death certificates. Brennan's giving us names, account numbers, timelines, the works. Jake closed his eyes. The web of deceit stretched further than he could have imagined. And the other victims? We've identified remains from 6 more families. Dr. Kim's team is working nonstop. Each ID lets us bring peace to more relatives. Like you. The call ended, but the weight of Torres' words lingered. Jake sat silently, replaying Michelle Thompson's gratitude and the unspoken cries of the other families still waiting. He thought of the burden he'd carried alone for 20 years. Maybe it didn't have to be that way for others. He began making calls to Detective Cross, to Agent Torres, to the FBI's Victim Services Coordinator. I want to help, he told them. I want to talk to the other families, help them through it. The coordinator sounded cautious. That's a generous offer, Mr. Morrison, but are you ready? Your own loss is still fresh. You might need time. I've had 20 years to prepare, Jake replied. They're just beginning that journey. If I can help ease their pain, I want to. We usually advise waiting. I'm not a therapist, Jake interrupted. I'm a survivor. I know what it feels like to wake up every day hoping for news, dreading it. That's not something you learn in school. 2 days later, Jake sat in a modest interview room in the Louisville FBI field office. Across from him sat Patricia Henderson. Her husband and 2 sons had vanished on a 1999 camping trip. Their blue pickup had been found in the sinkhole. Patricia gripped a coffee cup with trembling fingers. Her voice was calm but carried the weariness of years. Everyone told me to move on. They said I was wasting my life, waiting for people who were probably gone, but I couldn't leave. What if they came back? What if they needed me and I wasn't there? Jake leaned in. I understand. She met his gaze, skeptical. Do you really? Everyone says that, but unless you've lived it, the waiting, the hoping, the empty birthdays and holidays, you don't really understand. Jake nodded. I do. Every phone call, every unidentified body on the news, I hoped and feared it was them. It's like living with a wound that never closes. Patricia's composure cracked. Tears welled, not of weakness but of release. They spoke for 2 hours about missed milestones, awkward sympathies from friends, and the guilt that came with surviving. Thank you, she said finally, for understanding, for not giving up. Someone would have found that sinkhole eventually, Jake said. Maybe, but maybe not for 20 more years. My boys would have been middle-aged before I knew what happened. That evening, Jake called Cross. I want to do this full-time. I want to help every family who still needs answers. Cross hesitated. Jake, this kind of work's not easy. You're going to carry their grief on top of your own. I already do. But if I can turn what I went through into something that helps others, then it wasn't all for nothing. Cross exhaled, something between admiration and concern in her voice. All right, let's talk to the Bureau. I think they'd be lucky to have you. Jake knew the road ahead wouldn't be simple, but for the first time in years, he wasn't looking backward. He had a purpose bigger than himself, to ensure no one else had to wait alone for the truth. Some of these cases stretched back more than 2 decades. Some families had long stopped holding out hope, resigned to the silence that had replaced their loved ones. Others still burned with anger, angry at the justice system, angry at law enforcement, angry at the world for letting this happen. Jake knew the road ahead would be difficult. Nothing about any of this had ever been easy, and none of it would bring back the people he had lost. He stood in his quiet living room, surrounded by faded photographs and keepsakes that whispered of a life that no longer existed. These remnants of his past, the only pieces of his family he still possessed, seemed both precious and unbearable. No, Jake said, his voice steady despite the ache behind it. But maybe it'll help make sure no other family disappears the way mine did. There was a pause on the line. Then Cross spoke again, her tone softer. There's something else. The excavation at Hutchkins's old hunting cabin is complete. Jake's breath caught. They found remains belonging to 14 different families, she continued. 47 people. Jake repeated the number under his breath. 47 men, women, and children whose lives had been extinguished in silence. 47 families left to wonder and grieve without answers. Some had passed away, never knowing the truth. Others had spent years searching, just like Jake. But because you didn't stop looking, Cross added, 47 families now have a chance to come home. Jake ended the call and stepped outside. The same front porch where he'd watched his family drive off toward Kentucky all those years ago hadn't changed. The neighborhood still looked familiar, same streetlights, same houses. But everything felt foreign. The world had moved on, while Jake had been frozen in time, waiting for answers. But now, for the first time in decades, he had clarity. Tomorrow, he would begin reaching out to others, relatives of the victims, survivors who had lived in limbo. He would help guide them through the painful but necessary process, victim identification, funeral arrangements, and learning to live again in the shadow of justice. No, it wouldn't bring his family back. Nothing could undo what had been done. But maybe, just maybe, it would give their deaths meaning. Not as lines in a corrupt profit ledger, but as the turning point that finally exposed a monstrous conspiracy. Maybe his family's story would help ensure no one else would have to suffer the way he had. For half his life, Jake Morrison had searched for the truth. Now, he would dedicate the rest of it to helping others find their own. 3 weeks later, A cold wind blew through Riverside Cemetery in Columbus as 4 mahogany caskets were lowered into the earth. The funeral director had done his best, but after 20 years buried in Kentucky soil, there hadn't been much to recover. These coffins were mostly symbolic, honorific vessels meant to return the Morrison family to their rightful resting place. The ceremony was quiet, intimate. Aunt Carol stood wrapped in a heavy shawl, looking far more fragile than Jake remembered. A few old neighbors had shown up, familiar faces from the block where he'd grown up. Detective Cross was there, having driven up from Kentucky. So were Agent Torres and Dr. Kim. But one figure stood apart, half hidden under the shadow of a large oak tree. Jake recognized him immediately. Mike Brennan. It was a face from his past, once a friend, long before everything had been shattered. Their last meeting had been at graduation, before Jake knew that Mike's father, Rick Brennan, had helped orchestrate the murder of his entire family. After the service, as the crowd began to thin, Mike approached hesitantly. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for your family, and for what my father did." Jake studied him. Mike looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. Pale skin, deep circles under his eyes, and a nervous edge too. His voice. "You didn't know," Jake replied finally. "I should have," Mike said, his voice cracking. "I worked at the dealership with him during high school. I saw him going through customer records, making phone calls late at night. I thought it was just business. He fooled everyone. That's how he got away with it." Jake nodded slowly, the past settling between them like a fog. "There's something else," Mike said. "Something I found after they arrested him." Jake's posture shifted. "What kind of something?" "After the FBI searched the dealership, I went in to clean out his office. There was a hidden lockbox behind a false wall." Jake's pulse jumped. "What was inside?" "Photos," Mike whispered. "Hundreds of them. Families standing beside their new cars smiling, including yours. The day you bought the Honda." Jake could see the moment in his mind. His father was beaming. His mother and sisters are posing beside the yellow car. Ordinary joy, oblivious to what awaited them. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked. "Because there were more photos, new ones, families who bought cars after my dad went to prison. Some were taken just a few weeks ago." Jake stared at him. "Are you saying someone's still doing this?" "I think so," Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There were names, insurance policies, home addresses, everything, just like before." "Did you tell the FBI?" Mike hesitated. Number Y was scared. "If someone's still running the operation, and they know I found those photos." Jake stepped closer. "Who else works at the dealership now?" "Just me and my uncle Terry. He took over after my dad was arrested." Jake remembered Terry Brennan. Quiet. Always seemed like he lived in Rick's shadow. "You think your uncle is involved?" "I don't know," Mike said, frustration and fear battling in his expression. "Maybe. Or maybe someone else is using the old customer files. But the point is, this didn't end when my dad got caught." Jake felt a cold wave ripple through him. Just when he thought the nightmare had ended, it had only deepened. "Can you get me those photos?" he asked. Mike nodded. "Yeah, I didn't destroy them. I hid them somewhere safe." Jake took a deep breath. "Then get them. Tonight. We're taking them to the FBI." Mike reached into his jacket and carefully unfolded a worn piece of paper. "I copied down the names I saw in the photos," he said, his voice hushed as if the paper itself carried some dark secret. "Families who bought cars from the dealership in the last 6 months." Jake took the paper and began reading through the names. There were 8 in total, each followed by a local address. Normal, everyday names that meant nothing on their own. But Jake felt a growing unease as he scanned the list. "Do you know if any of these families are missing?" Mike looked away, shame flickering across his features. "That's the thing." "I don't know. I haven't looked into it. I was afraid of what I might find if I started digging." Jake held the list tighter, mind racing with possibilities. If someone really was continuing the same horrific operation that had taken his family, that meant other people might be in danger right now. We need to call Detective Cross. But before he could reach for his phone, Mike grabbed his arm. Wait, there's more. One of the names, the Taylors. I saw them on the news last week. A family of 4 that disappeared during a camping trip to West Virginia. Their van was found abandoned at a rest stop. No sign of them since. Jake felt the blood drain from his face. It was happening again. A family buys a car, goes on a vacation, then vanishes without a trace, just like his parents and sisters did all those years ago. When did they buy the car? 3 months ago, Mike answered. A blue minivan. My uncle told them it would be perfect for camping. Jake didn't hesitate. He pulled out his phone and dialed Cross. She answered quickly, her voice calm and familiar. How did the funeral go? She asked. There's no time for that, Jake said, his tone clipped. Someone's still running the same operation. It didn't end with Brennan. What are you talking about? Cross asked, now alert. Jake explained everything. Mike's discovery, the lockbox filled with photos, the recent disappearances, and specifically the Taylor family. There was a long pause. I'll be there tonight, Cross said finally. Don't do anything until I arrive. And Jake, keep Mike close. If someone is still running this, he's a threat to them now. Jake hung up and turned to Mike, who stood pale and visibly shaken. They stood next to the freshly filled graves of Jake's family. My Uncle Terry, Mike began, almost whispering. He was always around when I was a kid. Family cookouts, birthdays. He even taught me to ride a bike when Dad was too busy. Jake nodded grimly. People aren't always who we think they are, he said, remembering his own naive trust in Rick Brennan. If he's been doing this all along? Mike trailed off, his eyes wide with disbelief. Then we're going to stop him, Jake said. But even as he spoke, a chill crept up his spine. If Terry Brennan had continued his brother's deadly scam, he would have learned from the mistakes that had gotten Rick caught. He'd be more meticulous, more calculating, and more dangerous. If he had any reason to suspect Mike had discovered the truth, he might already be planning his next move. You can't go home, Jake said suddenly. Not tonight, not ever, not until this is over. If your uncle thinks you know anything, you're a target. Mike blinked. Where would I go? Jake looked out across the cemetery, at the solemn markers that stood as monuments to 20 years of unanswered questions. You're coming with me, he said. We'll talk to Cross and Torres. We'll build a plan and end this before anyone else dies. As they left the cemetery behind, Jake was overwhelmed by a twisted sense of déjà vu. He'd spent half his life pursuing justice for his family, and just when he thought it was over, the nightmare was resurfacing. But he wasn't a powerless teenager anymore. He knew the signs. He knew the tactics. This time, he would be ready. That night, Jake's modest home transformed into a makeshift command center. Detective Cross arrived first, followed by Agent Torres and an FBI technical specialist armed with laptops and satellite maps. Mike sat at Jake's kitchen table, trembling as he spread out the contents of his father's lockbox. Copies of documents, photographs, and insurance records. Everything that proved the operation hadn't died with Rick Brennan. Torres combed through the papers, his jaw tight with focus. This is extensive, he murmured. Detailed customer files, planned travel dates, insurance policy numbers. Someone's definitely carrying on the operation. Cross laid a large map of Ohio and Kentucky across the table. The Taylor family vanished 3 weeks ago, she said, marking a red dot on the map. Their vehicle was found abandoned here. That's almost identical to the intercept pattern we saw in your case, Jake. Jake leaned in. What about the other names on the list? Torres was already typing, cross-referencing databases. After a few minutes, he looked up grimly. The Yamamotos, family of 4, reported missing 4 days ago. Bought a Honda Pilot from Brennan Auto 6 weeks back. They were driving west to Yellowstone. Never made it. Mike's hand flew to his mouth. Oh God, how many families has my family helped kill? Jake reached out and put a firm hand on his shoulder. This isn't on you. Your father did this. Your uncle is doing it now. You're helping stop it. That matters. But as the words left his mouth, Jake couldn't shake the weight of what they were uncovering. Somewhere out in the darkness, more families might be dying. Terry Brennan hadn't just picked up where his brother left off. He'd refined the system, made it deadlier and more invisible. "We need eyes on the dealership," Cross said firmly, "and on Terry Brennan himself. If he's running this, we'll catch him in the act." Jake nodded. The war that had begun 2 decades ago wasn't over. It had just entered a new chapter. Torres lifted his eyes from the glowing laptop screen. "If he's planning another intercept, we have a problem. If Terry Brennan catches wind that we're closing in, he might flee, or worse, expedite his timeline and eliminate the families he's already marked." "Which families?" Jake asked, his voice tight with urgency. Torres swiveled the laptop around. The screen displayed a detailed customer database from Brennan's auto sales. Names, addresses, vehicle details. Some highlighted in red. Based on the pattern Mike uncovered, there are at least 3 families who've purchased vehicles recently and are slated for vacations in the next couple of weeks. Cross leaned in. If Terry's following his brother's schedule, those families are in immediate danger. Jake scanned the names. The Wilsons, set to visit the Grand Canyon in their new SUV. The Rodriguezes, planning a road trip to Disney World in a freshly bought minivan. And the Pattersons, the same family whose kitchen he'd been renovating before all of this unraveled. "I know them," Jake said, a chill threading through his spine. "I've done work for them. They mentioned a trip to Gatlinburg next week." Cross and Torres exchanged a knowing glance. "That lines up perfectly," Torres said. "Mountainous terrain, sparse traffic. Interception would be easy." "So what's the plan?" Mike asked, eyes darting between faces. "We can't just let them become victims." Cross's tone turned grim. "We use them, warn them, get their cooperation, set a trap." Jake's eyes flared. "You're suggesting putting a family with children in harm's way?" "They won't actually be in danger," Torres assured. "We'll have eyes on them the entire time. Surveillance teams, air support, we control every variable." Jake wasn't convinced. "That's what they said about my family 20 years ago. That everything was under control." Torres met his gaze. "Jake, if we hesitate now, Terry will vanish, and he'll take more families with him. We can't afford to wait for perfection. How many more funerals are you willing to attend?" Jake looked around the room. Cross, a career cop who had chased these ghosts for years. Torres, hardened by scenes like the one in the woods. Mike, haunted by his own bloodline. And out there somewhere, Terry Brennan, poring over files, selecting his next victims. "All right," Jake said. "What's the plan?" The operation was scheduled for Tuesday morning. The Pattersons would leave as planned, headed to Gatlinburg. Unbeknownst to them, FBI agents disguised as distant friends would follow, ready to intervene. Jake and Cross would be in the lead surveillance car, coordinating with backup teams stationed along the highway. Terry took the bait. Mike casually mentioned the Pattersons' vacation, even noting their preference for quiet routes. Terry showed keen interest, probing for the exact path and timeline. "Classic behavior," Torres said. "He's gathering intel while maintaining deniability." Tuesday dawned crisp and gray. Jake sat in Cross's unmarked sedan, binoculars in hand, watching the Patterson household. At 9:15, the front door swung open. The family filed out, parents, 2 teenagers, laughing and loading luggage into their shiny new SUV. It could have been any American family starting a vacation. Only this family knew they were prey. "Unit 3 in position," Torres's voice crackled over the radio. "Subject vehicle, leaving the dealership heading east on Route 33. Terry Brennan was following the exact same script his brother had written decades ago. Track the family, wait for them to reach the intercept point, and let his accomplices in law enforcement do the rest. But this time, Cross murmured, the law is watching him. As the Patterson SUV turned onto the highway, Jake's stomach twisted. They were traveling the same route his family had in 1998. The same deceptive sense of safety clung to the sunlit roads. Unit 7. Do you have a visual on the subject? Cross asked. Affirmative, came the reply. Terry's 1 mile back. He's made 2 phone calls in the last 10 minutes. He's setting up the intercept, Jake said. The convoy rolled south, leaving suburbia behind. Fields turned into forests. Civilization thinned. It was happening all over again. Movement, Torres's voice broke in. Subject exited at Route 682, parked at a gas station. The engine's running. He's on his phone again. Coordinating with his contact, Cross said. Jake's pulse pounded. He's timing the stop. Unit 5 status? Cross barked. Fake deputy in place at mile marker 127. Cruiser visible. Ready for intercept. Jake's blood turned to ice. Mile marker 127. The same spot where his family's journey ended. The familiar terrain of Kentucky's back roads stretched ahead as Jake kept his eyes locked on the movement unfolding. The air in the surveillance vehicle was tense, heavy with anticipation. Just ahead, on the same stretch of highway where tragedy had struck his family 2 decades ago, another grim confrontation was building. Torres' voice broke through the static of the radio. Subject is mobile again. Brennan's truck is back on Highway 33, tracking the target vehicle. Jake's fingers tightened around the door handle. The coincidence felt too exact to be accidental. What's the location? He asked, already fearing the answer. Approaching mile marker 127, Torres confirmed. A sharp breath escaped Jake's lips. That was the exact spot. The very place where, 20 years earlier, his family had been intercepted under the guise of a routine traffic stop, then vanished into thin air. Terry Brennan wasn't just replicating his brother Rick's method. He was retracing every step, as though following a twisted script. They drove on in silence, the convoy snaking through the Kentucky landscape, the forested hills blurring past. Somewhere ahead, Terry Brennan believed he was approaching another successful accident, another orchestrated disappearance. But this time, law enforcement was not playing his game. They were rewriting the rules. Target vehicle is approaching intercept, Cross announced, her voice composed. All units, prepare for contact. Jake's gaze landed on the Patterson family's SUV, cruising calmly along the road. He imagined the parents trying to act natural, the teenagers texting or staring out the window, all the while knowing they were part of a carefully planned sting. They had placed their trust in the FBI in this plan, in Jake himself. Subject vehicle is accelerating, Torres said suddenly. He's closing in on the Pattersons. Cross leaned forward. Unit 7, confirm subject's movement. Subject has passed the target vehicle, came the confused reply. He's not stopping at the intercept point. He's continuing south. Jake felt a chill crawl up his spine. He knows, he said flatly. Somehow, he knows. All units, aboard intercept. Cross ordered immediately. Do not engage. Suspect is aware of surveillance. But Jake's heart began pounding faster. Through the windshield, he could see the unimaginable. Up ahead, Terry Brennan's truck had swerved sideways, blocking both lanes of the highway. It was a deliberate barricade. He's boxed them in, Jake muttered, his voice cracking. The Patterson's SUV skidded to a halt just short of Terry's truck. Behind them, the surveillance vehicles had no room to pass. The family was trapped. Then Terry emerged. He wasn't holding a citation pad or a fake badge. He was gripping a shotgun. Suspect is armed, Cross shouted into the radio. Target family is in immediate danger. Jake didn't hesitate. He flung open the sedan door and ran toward the confrontation, ignoring Cross's calls to stop. This couldn't be another massacre. Not again. Terry! Jake yelled. It's over! You're surrounded! Terry Brennan turned to face him. The shotgun followed his motion, barrel aimed directly at Jake's chest. You just couldn't leave it alone, could you? Terry snarled. Rick always said you were too dumb to let the past stay buried. Jake's heart thudded in his chest, but he kept moving forward. Your brother murdered my family for a paycheck. How many others did you kill to keep that blood money flowing? Terry's lip curled. Not enough. His finger tightened on the trigger. Jake braced himself. A single, thunderous crack shattered the silence. Terry staggered back, a clean bullet hole blooming in his chest. The shotgun fell from his hands, clattering to the pavement as he collapsed beside his truck. Upon a wooded ridge, Agent Torres lowered his rifle. The sniper's shot had struck home before Terry could fire. Jake stood motionless over the body, watching the life drain from the man who had carried on the legacy of his family's destruction. The victory tasted bitter. There was no joy, no elation, just exhaustion, grief, and the dull weight of finality. Cross approached slowly, weapon lowered but ready. "Are you all right?" Jake looked past her to the Pattersons, who were now emerging from their SUV. Pale, shaken, but alive. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think I am." 3 months later, the sun was high over a field behind Jake's house in Columbus. A construction crew was hard at work, pouring concrete and setting rebar into place. A wooden sign hung on the chain-link fence read, "Morrison Family Crisis Center, helping families find their way home." The building, still skeletal, would someday house counselors, legal advocates, and investigative support for families of the missing. The funding came from a book deal Jake had reluctantly accepted. His story, once a private pain, would now serve to bring awareness, justice, and support to others still trapped in the hell of not knowing. "Feels real now, doesn't it?" Cross asked, walking up beside him with 2 steaming cups of coffee. Jake accepted one with a nod. "Terrifying, actually. For 20 years I only had one goal: find my family. Now I have to help others do the same." "You've been doing that already," Cross reminded him. "Michelle Thompson, Patricia Henderson, dozens of families you've helped connect to answers. You're good at this, Jake." He smiled faintly and watched as workers smoothed the foundation slab. Soon, the center would stand as a physical symbol of hope and determination, built on the pain of the past, but focused squarely on the future. "I got a call yesterday," Jake said, taking a sip of coffee. "A woman in Oregon. Her daughter disappeared 6 months ago. The police think she ran away, but the mom's not convinced. You going to help her?" Jake nodded. "I already booked the flight." Cross looked at him, eyes soft. "Your family would be proud, you know. You've taken all the pain and turned it into something that helps people." Jake looked out across the quiet street he had walked 1,000 times as a kid. It was the same neighborhood, the same porch he'd watched his family leave from on that terrible day. Nothing and everything had changed. "I used to think the worst thing that ever happened to me was staying home sick that morning," he said. "Now I know the worst thing would have been never finding out the truth." He used to believe missing the trip that took their lives was the greatest tragedy of his youth. For years, the guilt consumed him. Being the only one left behind, the one who survived simply because he'd stayed home sick. But now, after everything he'd uncovered, all the people he'd helped, Jake understood the deeper truth. If he'd been in that car with them, if Terry Brennan had taken him too, none of this would have happened. The secrets would have stayed buried, and the other families would never have been found. The entire horror of Brennan's operation might have continued unchecked. "I always wished I could have saved them," Jake said, his voice heavy as he stared across the construction site. "But maybe I was supposed to save others instead." A loud engine approached, interrupting his thoughts. A pickup truck rumbled to a stop, and Jake turned to see Mike Brennan behind the wheel. Mike had been working alongside Jake on the Crisis Center's construction for several months now, an effort to rebuild not just structures, but lives. It had been a long road since the truth about his father and uncle shattered everything he thought he knew. Cross followed Jake's gaze and watched Mike step out and begin unloading tools. "How's he holding up?" "He still has nightmares," Jake admitted. "Wakes up sweating, hearing his dad's voice, but he's committed. He wants to make it right, in any way he can." Cross nodded solemnly. "And the dealership?" "Closed for good," Jake said. "Mike donated the land to the county. They're turning it into a memorial park. There'll be a monument with the names of every victim the Brennan family ever hurt." Cross finished her coffee and glanced at her watch. "I've got to get back to Kentucky." We're chasing leads on 3 more cases. Looks like someone's copying the same scheme in other states now. Rental cars this time. But the method's the same. Find insured families, intercept them during travel, and collect the payout. Jake nodded, unsurprised. Greed's a hard thing to kill. After she left, Jake wandered the unfinished foundation of the Morrison Family Crisis Center, stepping over piles of rebar and walking through the skeletal outlines of rooms still to come. He envisioned what it would become, a sanctuary for families who were desperate for answers, conference rooms where they could sit with investigators, a library of resources for those searching for missing loved ones, and offices for trauma counselors and victim advocates. But most important of all, in the main lobby, there would be a wall. A memorial wall. He pictured the faces on it. His parents, David and Sarah. His sisters, Jenny and Sarah. The Yamamotos, the Hendersons, Michelle Thompson's family. Dozens of others, faces that had once been names on cold insurance paperwork, reduced to numbers in a profit scheme. But here, they'd be remembered as people. Mothers, fathers, children, loved, missed, and never forgotten. Jake's phone rang. An unknown number. He answered instinctively. Morrison Family Crisis Center, he said, even though the building wasn't yet finished. A woman's voice, soft and southern, came through. Is this Jake Morrison? Yes, ma'am. My name's Linda Martinez. My husband and son went missing during a camping trip back in 2001. I saw your story on the news, and I was hoping maybe you could help me find them. Jake turned and looked at the building rising from the soil, walls beginning to frame a future no one could have imagined 20 years ago. He smiled gently. That's exactly what we're here for, he said.